17 or 18 years ago, my fiancée, now wife of nearly 16 years myself, and one of the couple were hiking the Pyramid Point hiking trail in the Sleeping Bear Dunes of the northwest lower peninsula of Michigan at dusk. We had my old film camera with a 200mm zoom lens on it. We got to the overlook, which looks northwest, over Manitou Passage, to the Manitou Islands, and watched the sunset, and entered that late dusk period that seems to last forever during a northern Michigan summer. It was probably 10 p.m. at this point. There were high winds and solid waves breaking on shore below us. The Pyramid Point overlook is maybe 150 to 200 above Lake Michigan, but it didn't look any rougher than many evenings on Lake Michigan, where 5-meter breaking waves are fairly routine, and windy nights and crashing waves provide great white noise for sleeping in a tent. As we were camping elsewhere, there's no camping at this trail. While standing and talking, we saw a light flash once out in the water between the island and the mainland, in the vicinity of the North Manitou Shoal Lighthouse, a crib lighthouse standing alone in the water, not inhabited or staffed, but tempting for visitors, I would assume. We stopped and looked, but weren't creeped out by it at all. After all, boaters are out in this stretch of water fairly regularly, though not in high winds and waves. I grabbed my camera to look through the zoom lens and make out what appeared to be a small boat, though it was difficult to tell with a 200mm lens. It was a 7-mile wide stretch of water to the nearest island, so we were probably 3 to 4 miles away from the actual light source. We had flashlights, so we shined our lights, which from several miles away might not have even been visible. We waved the flashlights in the direction of the light we'd seen. Immediately it came back and started flashing SOS in Morse code, which was a huge surprise to us. We weren't even sure our lights were bright enough to be seen at that distance, and given that the stretch of shore is almost all forested, we were at a little spot several miles away. Suddenly, we were full of concern and adrenaline. 2 of us ran back to the car, which is half a mile through the woods in the dark down a hill with our flashlight, and got a cell phone and binoculars. While we were gone, the folks on the lookout had no light source. At the car, we called the Coast Guard from our cell phones. Bear in mind this was 1999, so these weren't smartphones by any stretch of the imagination. We explained to the Coast Guard that someone was flashing SOS out in the water, and that we were hikers observing this from the Pyramid Point overlook. They said they'd send a ship to look over the area, and we asked them to hurry. At this point, we ran back up to the overlook with binoculars, our phone, and our flashlight. It's about half a mile and a steep hill. Atop the overlook, there was no cell signal, so we had to pocket the phone and had no further communication with the Coast Guard. Our binoculars were able to see a guy in an aluminium rowboat, rowing like crazy with waves breaking over the bow of his boat. It was nearly pitch black outside, so we were only barely able to make this out. At about 10:30 or 10:45 at this point during a Michigan summer, it's still light enough to see out well. He would occasionally turn around, flash SOS at us, and go back to rowing. It was disturbing to be several miles away from a completely helpless person as we watched him struggle in the rowboat in the dark. As you can imagine, darkness fell. He could not see anything more, and every few minutes the man in the rowboat would flash SOS at us. He did not appear to be making any progress towards the mainland, but he was clearly drifting northwards through the Manitou Passage. Every time he'd flashed, we'd turn on our flashlight, shine it back at him for a few seconds and turn it off. We did not know Morse code, and we had no cell signal. We stood and watched for what seemed like forever, completely helpless. The man stopped flashing his light. It was too dark to see the boat. A tugboat that didn't appear to be the Coast Guard ship showed up and started doing a grid search pattern through the passage with bright lights shining from boat to water. The Manitou Passage is probably 6 to 7 miles wide and 6 to 7 miles long, so it was a slow search. A smallish Coast Guard ship started doing searches on the northern end of the straits, also with bright lights. They met in the middle of the strait, having done a zigzag pattern for what felt like an eternity. Then they sailed off. They did not appear to find anyone. We drove into a bar in Glen Arbor to see if there was anything on the news, and there wasn't. We called the Coast Guard the next day, wondering if we'd seen a man die, or helped to rescue, or neither. But the person on duty had no idea what happened due to shift change, or that we'd even called the night before. To this day, it's unsettling to me, knowing how harsh these conditions can be on Lake Michigan, and knowing that we'd seen a man flash SOS at us through our binoculars. Just before it got dark, it was really bothersome, though not as bothersome as the poor guy in the boat, who had to wonder why we weren't doing anything for him. No closure, no happy or sad ending, no ending at all really, other than going back to our camp and hitting the sack. I often wonder about that guy. I hope he was found. My younger sister, in her early 20s, was in Colorado 2 years ago and went hiking with her friend. The plan was to hike up the mountain, stop midway in camp, then finish the hike the next morning. They started their hike and stopped for camp midway. She said it started dumping it with rain that night, which meant the top would be likely snowy. The next morning they continued their hike, but it started getting complicated. Her friend only wore Chaco sandals and not proper hiking boots, as they did not expect snow. They stopped at a creek and were deciding if they wanted to turn back, on account that they were not properly prepared, when they heard a faint, "Help me." They both stood still and heard it again. They decided to follow up the creek to the woman's voice. They got to a clearing that was covered in snow and found a woman laying in it. Basic athletic clothing, leggings, lightweight pullover jacket, and athletic shoes. My sister said her legs were swollen, discolored, and had nasty cuts on them. My sister asked how long she'd been out there, and the woman said only a few hours. My sister was like, "Okay, we need to get you down the mountain." The woman was like, "No, I need to go up the mountain, that's where my car's parked." My sister was like, "No, there's no driving access at the top," which was the sign that the woman was confused. They get her down the mountain, and my sister just kept saying how confused the woman was. They get to the bottom, and they find her car. My sister couldn't get cell service to call 911 during this time, and my sister tells the woman she's going to drive her to the hospital, but the woman is standing strong that she would just like to go back to her bed and breakfast. My sister takes her there while driving this woman's car. Once the woman is at the bed and breakfast, she thanks them and goes in. My sister spoke to the owners and was like, "You have to call a medic. She's severely confused and not acting normal." They call a medic, which transports her to a hospital. Turns out this woman was from Chicago, had low blood pressure, and it was her first time ever hiking a mountain. She was also alone. She had passed out during her hike, then it dumped snow on her. She was hypothermic, and only thought she'd been out for a few hours. She was out overnight in the dark, cold, and alone. I can't imagine the terror she must have felt. Anyway, my sister went and saw her at the hospital, and the woman thanked her for saving her life. They still lightly keep in touch. I was hiking late at night at a trail when we kept hearing faint footsteps behind us. My friend can be a little paranoid and kept saying, "Dude, there's someone following us." I didn't believe him. Eventually, we were standing next to some brush, and behind it we hear human footsteps. If you've ever been in a situation like this, you know for a fact that it's not an animal. You can hear the two legs rhythmically walking, plus an animal most likely, at the presence of humans, would either stand completely still or just run away. This sounds straight up like a man walking towards us from the woods. Say what you want, but we knew what it was. We turned around and booked it as fast as we could until we were on the road. On the way back, to make things more adrenaline rushed, we heard more footsteps in the woods behind us. I thought we were literally about to have to fight off a homeless dude in the woods, but I turned around and shined my flashlight to where I heard the sound to see 4 pairs of glowing eyes staring at us. There were coyotes. We could hear even more in front and some circling around us. From the sounds of them walking in the eyes, I could see we think there were at least 7 or 8 of them. I had never been in a situation with wildlife like that before, but it seemed like they were stalking us. My friend was a hunter, and I asked him if he confirmed, and he said they definitely were. We did the whole assert your dominance and stay aggressive while maintaining eye contact thing, and just walked away. They followed us for a bit and eventually got lost. As soon as we knew we were in the clear, we ran all the way to the campsite. I was 15 at the time, so we immediately woke up my mum and told her. It was scary as hell to think that all it would have taken was one of those coyotes to pounce and the rest would have probably have followed. Also, it was the one walk in the entire day when I didn't bring my knife. Although it was scary, we had a cool story to tell everyone when we got back. Hey guys, there was a dude following us in the woods in the middle of the night, and then we got stalked by coyotes. What you're about to hear is the most traumatic experience of my life. It was New Year's Eve, and me and my girlfriend Jane were getting ready to go see some fireworks. Jane and I knew a great spot deep in the woods where we could see the fireworks and left at about 9:30, as the show was starting at 10. We made sure to pack some food, water, flashlights, and even a compass in case we got lost. We parked our car on the side of the road and made our way to the spot. I would say about a 15-minute walk or so until we reached it, which was a huge clearing surrounded by woods on all sides. Jane and I sat down and started watching the fireworks show. About 15 minutes into the show, Jane looks at the woods and says, "Did you see that?" I was confused and looked in the direction of the woods Jane was talking about, but saw nothing. I told her it was probably just a deer, and we continued watching the fireworks show. 5 minutes passed by, and I had completely forgotten about the incident, until Jane tells me to shush. I'm confused and ask why, and she says, "Do you hear that?" I listen closely, and can hear leaves crunching and twigs snapping. I look in the direction of the sound, and can somewhat make out the figure of a man. At first I didn't believe it, but then a bright firework lit up the night sky along with the woods, and I can now clearly see a man about 6'3" walking towards us. I'm about 6'5", and probably could have taken on this man if he wanted trouble. But everything changed when another firework revealed a large knife in his hand. I tell Jane to run, and we both dart back into the woods in the direction of our car. All the while this man is running about 20 feet behind us. After 2 or 3 minutes of running, we managed to lose the guy. But when we arrived at my car, I made a horrifying discovery. All 4 of my tires had been slashed. We didn't know what to do. My car's tires were slashed, and there was a maniac trying to kill us. And all in the while, Jane was going crazy. I tried calling 911, but just my luck, I had no service. Fortunately, we saw a truck coming down the road and Jane quickly flagged down the driver. It parked behind us, and a large dude stepped out. We quickly explained what was going on, and he went back to his truck and pulled out a gun along with a satellite phone, which we used to call the police, and they said they'd be there in minutes. While we were waiting, Jane investigated the woods and screamed. I quickly looked over in the direction she was looking in, and I see the man walking towards us. Jane yells that it's him. The driver of the truck takes one good look at him and fires a warning shot. The gunshot sends him running back into the woods, and after 3 minutes of waiting in fear, the cops arrive. They call in a team to check the woods, along with a AAA truck to fix my car. The rest of the night was me and Jane at the police station, and we tried to give our best description, but it was so dark we could barely make out his face. This had to have been the worst New Year's of my life. I don't know what would have happened if Jane hadn't have spotted him.
We haven't ever been to that spot since. As you can imagine, it's not on our agenda.
I grew up in Southern California. One thing about that part of the state you often hear is that you can go surfing and skiing on the same day. But assuming the traffic was light, you could pull it off. I grew up in the Inland Empire, which is about 60 to 90 miles east of LA. We lived near the foothills of the San Bernardino Mountains. My father is a mountain man. I can't overstate enough that he is truly in his element when he is lost in the mountains. He has spent his entire life exploring the local mountains, and he knows every back road, service road, trail, and has even had a specialized bump key that he can use to unlock Forest Service road blocks. I'm going to tell you 2 stories involving my dad and I in the mountains, where some weird stuff went down. The first story happened when I was in Boy Scouts. Because my dad was one, he wanted me to have those wilderness experiences and become capable out there. And I'm grateful for that, as I had a great time in the Scouts, and even though I'm a big city boy, I'm confident that I can go toe-to-toe with my dad in a wilderness survival contest. We were at the San Bernardino Mountains on a camp out one time, and our camp was pretty deep in the woods. We hiked from 6 a.m. till sunset to get to our campsite. Granted, this is a group of scouts of varying ages and abilities in the mountains, so take that into account. My dad and I set up our tent pretty far from the rest of the group, at least 50 meters from the central campfire. We always did this because the younger boys would be up all night making noise, and we liked to sleep after a day of mountaineering. We had just gotten into our mummy bags and finally got comfy when we started to hear rock clicking on the ridge above us, about another 50 to 100 meters up from the valley. My dad is a big-time Sasquatch believer, and I certainly believe there are things in the wilderness that humans cannot comprehend. And there is plenty of wilderness in the United States for anything to hide for as long as it wants. My dad gets on the radio to another scout leader and asks for them to do a head count of the boys, and if any of the adults had gone off into the woods. Everyone was accounted for. This wasn't a particularly popular trail, so it's unlikely anyone else was in the area besides us. So we get quiet and just listen. We noticed that there were no animal/insect noises in the area at this time. We were just lying there in our tent, listening intently. I was trying to listen over the sound of my heart beating out of my chest. It was so quiet that I could hear the blood pulsating in my brain. More rock clicking. And these weren't little rocks. They sounded like significantly large rocks, too heavy for a human of average strength to hold in each hand and bang together that hard. My heart was racing at this point. I'm not so much scared as I am excited. My dad and I spent a lot of time in the mountains when I was a kid, so I was quite familiar with all kinds of animal noises and things that go bump in the night. I believed my dad when he told me that Sasquatch aren't violent creatures, but it was territorial and would let you know when you crossed a boundary. Rock clicking and throwing are one of those signals. We heard rocks being flung off the ridge and crashing down in the valley below. About 30 to 50 meters downhill drop. Though not a sheer drop, there had to be some serious strength to throw these rocks that far. It sounded like they were being thrown. Then it got quiet. It was quiet for long enough that we figured old Biggie was done and had gone off to bed. All of a sudden, we hear a whole ass tree being ripped out of the ground. Keep in mind it's about 75 meters away and probably 30 meters above our elevation. This valley had a solid echo to it, but I kid you not, I could hear the roots of this tree being ripped up from the ground. Now I was getting scared. It's one thing to throw rocks at intruders like us, and it's another to rip a damn tree out of the ground. But that was it. After that, we were left with nothing but silence, and none of the group heard a peep for the rest of the night. The next day, we all hiked up to the ridge and checked out the area.
We found large rocks that had been cracked open, and we found a spot where we think a tree may have been pulled out, but no tree nearby. We found some thick hair caught in the bark of a few trees, and it smelled like garbage sitting in a hot metal trash can in the summer. The ground was too firm for any definitive footprints to be found, but there were a lot of branches on the ground broken off surrounding trees up until about 8 feet. My dad and I and a few other leaders decided we had disturbed the peace enough, and we packed up the camp and moved on. There were no further incidents during this trip, and we never told the other scouts. This second story happened on the other side of San Bernardino Peak. My dad and I were hiking up to the summit, where he had spread his father's ashes back in 1987, and just a few months after I was born. We had tried multiple times to get to the summit, but my dad was in his 40s at the time and had high blood pressure, which always made him too weak to be about 8,500 feet. Anyway, he was on a new medication now and was determined to summit the peak and have a little spiritual moment with me, where his dad was laid to rest. My grandfather was a serious badass World War II veteran who was a B-17 flying fortress mechanic in England, but he would regularly fly missions as a gunner when they were short on men, and would also fly in gliders by night into France to repair salvageable bombers that had been downed during bombing runs. So needless to say, his legacy was important to us, as we were going to get to the top of that damn mountain this time. It was a particularly hot day, and when you're above the clouds and smog, the air is cooler, but the sun is more oppressive. It can lull inexperienced hikers into a sense of safety. We weren't well prepared for this hike, as we had underestimated the exposure factor that day. We only bought 2 large water bottles because we wanted to be as light as possible. Well, about 3/4 of the way up the mountain, we ran out of water. It was kind of a decision point. We either bust our asses up the mountain and get down quick, or we call it quits. My dad suddenly remembers a mountain spring not far from us, and suggests we hustle down there and fill our bottles. We had water purifying tablets, so we weren't worried about parasites often found in spring water that causes unpleasant plumbing problems. So we jaunt down to the spring, only to find that it had dried up. Now we were in a real pickle. We had to trek back down at least 1,000 feet to get back to the trail, and we were seriously parched at this point. So with no other alternative, we hike back up to the trail. At this point, I'm literally sucking the sweat off my shirt to get my tongue wet. We didn't see any other cars in the trailhead parking lot, so had run into no other hikers. As far as we knew, we were totally alone on the mountain that day. So we're standing there panting and trying to figure out what to do, when along comes a man down the trail from the direction of the summit. It almost looked like he was floating. He was so gently trotting down the trail towards us. He was an older, grey-haired and short grey-bearded man with hiking poles and a blue bandana wrapped round his head. He stood in front of us and said, "Lovely day, isn't it, fellas?" It was around 10 a.m, and we'd been hiking for around 4 hours already, so it was odd that this guy was already on his way down. My dad asks, "Did you sleep up there the night before, or are you the fastest hiker alive?" with a chuckle. My dad always had a way of keeping his cool in a bad situation, and he just wanted to be friendly with the guy in the hopes he may give us some water. "Oh no, I've seen what I've come here to see, and I'll be off shortly," the man said. I remember that exact quote because it seemed so odd for him to say. He continued on to say, "You boys look pretty thirsty. You ran out of water? The mountain can be quite deceiving on a hot day like this, right?" My dad replied, "Funny you should mention that. We did run out of water." Before my dad can continue, the man interjected, "And you both went down to that spring over yonder and found it dry, no?" pointing towards it. We both nodded our heads, dumbfounded. The spring was very well hidden. My dad said to me before that probably no one alive today besides him knows about this spring. The man continued. Well, I've got about a gallon of water here in my pack. Probably not enough for you to summit today, but enough to get you hydrated and down the mountain. He produced a gallon jug of water and said, drink it in good health. And come prepared next time, okay? I don't reckon I'll always be around to save your asses. We took the water and thanked him profusely. And with a grin on his face, he continued trotting down the trail like it was nothing. This was a pretty difficult trail zone and had a lot of rocks and uneven parts, but I distinctly remember this old man just breezing through it like he was just floating. We drank a few good sips, filled our bottles and headed back. Around the bend there was a long series of switchbacks, and this was above the tree line, so there wasn't really anything to obstruct our view the whole way down this section of trail. But when we rounded the bend and looked down, the man was gone. There's no way he could have descended these switchbacks that fast, even if he was floating along the path. My dad and I looked at each other, and without a word started down the trail back to the car. To this day we are convinced that the man was an angel sent to save our asses. We eventually made it to the summit on another trip, well prepared this time, and we had a ceremony honoring the memory of my grandfather. And we also gave thanks for the angel that had seen what he came to see that one day. Two thirsty men who needed a drink and a lesson.
About 25 years ago, I went hiking in Fossil Falls, just outside of Ridgecrest, California with some friends. Once we hiked down the falls, we got to the opening of the canyon and started smelling what smelt like something dead. As we walked on, the smell got stronger, and we decided to find out what it was. We come upon an area where the smell is overpowering. On the surface of the ground in this area, there appeared to be a few oil slicks pooled at the top of the surface of the ground, which appeared to have been dug recently. We attempt to dig down about 6 inches, but the smell is beyond anything we can deal with. We decide to leave and call the cops. The cops get down into the canyon part of the fall, picks up on the smell and tells us it isn't a good sign. As we get closer, but not even the place where the smell is coming from, he starts to call a lot of reinforcements, cops, helicopters, etc. He told us that for something to generate that kind of smell, someone would have had to have buried a deer or something familiar to make it. When we called the cops to follow up on what happened, they told us it was just some chicken skin and bone. No human remains were found. The official story completely conflicted with what the cop, who had previously been a homicide investigator in LA, had told us. When I told a co-worker what happened, he reached out to a higher-up that he knew at the Department of the Forestry Service, and when he relayed the story, he was told, "How did you know about this? You shouldn't know about this, and those guys should forget about it immediately." My theory is that someone was killed and buried on government land, and they didn't want it to get out. There's no way in or out of that canyon, unless by military access road, from the China Lake Weapons Center.
This is my dad's story. My dad was always a pretty interesting person and has had a lot of paranormal things happen in his life. Here is my favorite story when from he was a kid. My dad grew up in the era of the late 60s. He was raised in a pretty rural part of Texas, about a 2 to 3 hour drive north of Houston. My grandpa was a big fan of hunting, and so was my dad. One day when he was about 12, he woke up before dawn to get ready to do some hunting with his brother, who was about a year younger than him. My dad goes to wake up my uncle, but he didn't budge, so my dad said screw it, he'd go alone. He leaves the house and ventures into the woods with a flashlight, his rifle and some trail mix. He walked for a while, enough to where the sun was coming up and no longer needed the flashlight. After about half an hour of walking, he felt a sudden chill, like something was watching him. He gripped his gun and looked over. When he found nothing, he kept walking. Suddenly he heard a twig snap. Now here is where it starts to get creepy. My dad was standing still, waiting and listening. Then it started. He could hear someone laughing. It sounded far away, but the laugh chilled him to the bone. Thinking it was his brother, he called out to him, told him to stop messing around before he shoots. Yet there was no response, only laughter. So my dad got scared and began walking back towards the house. Now he was quite a distance, at least an hour's worth of walking away. As he walked, he could hear the laughter. It sounded much closer. He started to jog, but it seemed the faster he moved, the closer the laugh got. He got angry and started yelling for whoever was following and laughing to stop, and that he was armed. The laughter escalated and became unsettling and was coming from all around him. Then, abruptly stopped, and a deep voice said, "I'm gonna get you." This scared the hell out of my dad, and he took off running, dropping his snack and flashlight. The hysterical laughter got aggressive and started back again so loud my dad dropped to his knees and covered his ears. He felt all this pressure around him and felt like the world was getting darker, like it was taking control. He summoned all his courage, pulled the trigger up to his rifle, and a single gunshot silenced the laughter. Whatever was chasing him was gone. He quickly gathered his stuff together and bolted, and did not stop running until he reached the porch of my grandparents' house. He told his dad what happened, and my grandpa told him to never go into the woods alone, that the woods hold more secrets than we know. My dad continued to go into the woods to hunt, but never alone. Even when he was an old man, he would go hunting in those same woods, but not without company. My roommate and I lived in the woods during quarantine. We spent the days there, storm or shine, drinking beers, picking up trash, swimming and just goofing around. We also started doing something that sounds odd to say out loud, but at the time kept us sane. We'd get in the woods, strip off to our socks and shoes, hike in silence to this little lagoon where we'd lay out. It was insanely meditative, and I absolutely loved just barefoot wandering. It felt so satisfying in this primal sort of way. Anyway, the more we roamed like that, the more in tune we got with the woods around us, without the chatter between us and the careless stomping of booted feet. We'd become part of the woods in this weird way. Probably helped that I was stoned out of my mind half the time. We'd surprise people pretty often without meaning to, passing within a few feet before they noticed us. It was like our guts started calling the shots. We could feel storms brewing. All the creatures seemed to stop minding us when we walked like that, so whenever the woods went silent we knew something was coming. It was one of those days, with thick skies and electricity in the air. It'd been stormy for a few days and the woods were pretty empty. We'd only seen maybe 2 other souls all day. Darkness had really started to creep in, although not taking control quite yet, but quicker than usual. We were heading out of the woods barefoot and knocking back the dregs of some warm crap beer, chatting about nothing. I remember we were coming up this hill when all of a sudden it was like I'd swallowed a snowball. I look up at her and she was frozen mid-laugh. Something was wrong. The woods were off. We were surrounded by murky shadows and dead silence. Heavy silence. Tense silence. Then we heard it. It was this metallic sort of sound, a kind of clanging we couldn't really make out. Metal striking stone. Over and over. A bit further down the trail, squarely in between us and the way out. We stood like statues tucked behind some trees just listening. A shovel. Someone was digging. We crept closer. I remember how the sound made my palms itch. My friend's face was flushed, rose red. I told myself I was being stupid. In fact, I had a backpack, a little spade we used to plant flowers and dig up rocks and such within it. Who was I to judge this person? But then again, that was a little garden spade. And as we got closer, it became clear that this person had a full-on shovel and was digging in the middle of the trail. I kept trying to explain it to myself. This person was just digging. Sure, it was dusk and a lightning storm was hastening our way, but we all cope with quarantine differently. And sure, it's odd to carry a big shovel this deep into the woods, but maybe they're burying a beloved pet. And sure, it makes no sense they'd bury their pet in the middle of the trail, but maybe they're digging a bike jump. And yeah, they don't have a bike, but on and on like that, my mind churning out reasons, and still, the knots in my gut wouldn't loosen. We were almost on him now. I think it was a him. Though they were wearing a scarf, hat, and heavy clothes, all black. A bit odd for summer. But again, he might be mourning for his sweet Fido, who loved that spot, in the middle of a narrow dirt trail. With every step, my stomach hurt more. We were both shining in sweat. The sound of metal striking earth and stone seemed deafening. It's sort of a primal fear, isn't it? Rooted deep in our guts, completely deaf to every excuse I was handing out. We were just waltzing along 1 minute, cracking jokes, slugging beers, and suddenly, it was like every neuron was firing, every muscle tight enough to snap. My mind racing. I was taking stock of everything. 2 girls, barefoot, in swimsuits and overalls, 2 empty beer cans, and a bag of found trash, and a backpack of random stuff. My friend was holding our bucket of rocks, though we picked skinny flat rocks for skipping, not for self-defense. I had a can of pepper spray buried somewhere in my bag, but much to my mother's dismay, I bet I couldn't easily access it. And that stupid spade. It feels so insane looking back. I've never been in a fight. I've never raised my voice. I spent most of my days talking to toddlers about emotional regulation, and yet, here I suddenly was, tallying up what I had on hand against a total stranger. But all these excuses I'd fashioned for him had fallen away, and only one thought stuck. Maybe this gut feeling is wrong. Maybe he's doing any of a million things. Maybe he'd feel awkward or embarrassed seeing us bolt away. What is the cost if it's right? If we walk past and he swings the shovel, then what? What would the excuse cost us? Something shifted. I don't know what. It felt like such a high voltage situation, a single spark in a gas-choked room. My friend went white, said the first words we'd exchanged the whole time, and said, "Don't look, just run." We ran, chased down into the woods and off the trail, close to the water. We could jump if he chased us. We sprinted, leaping over boulders, ducking under trees, thorns and stones sticking into our bare soles. I didn't feel them though. I didn't notice the blood on my feet till we broke out of the tree line. Later, we tried to piece it together, tried to understand what had happened. We were cucumber cool ordinary, and definitely felt a sense of invincibility sneaking around the woods. It wasn't until we were home safe, bandaging our feet, that we figured it out, as far as we ever would. The spark had been silence. He had stopped shoveling. And, safe at home, I admitted that I'd looked back, just a glance for a split second. He had stopped shoveling and started walking towards us.
I'm a female and the youngest of a large Hispanic family. My father had a lifetime of adventures and interesting stories, one of which used to give me nightmares when I was a child. This happened back in the early 70s. My father had a rough life and a devastating upbringing. He was short in stature as he was of Japanese descent. He was also aggressive and fearless. He had a don't mess with me kind of attitude. My father was an outdoorsman, and he was always armed. He would also indulge in liquid courage, more often than he cared to admit. You get the picture. This particular night took place in Sierra Madre, which is located in the wooded mountains in Mexico where we lived. It was a typical night. My father was horseback riding home, which would take about 2 hours. In his drunken stupor, he heard someone calling his name from the woods. "Tranquil. Hey, tranquil." It was a raspy voice he didn't recognize, and although it was too dark for him to see, he wasn't concerned. He replied by shouting back angrily, "Who are you? How do you know my name?" But he kept on riding. The voice persisted. "Tranquil. Hey, tranquil." At this point, the unnerving voice put him on edge. Suddenly the horse got spooked. Father was bucked off by his horse, who took off galloping into the darkness. Unfortunately, his foot got stuck on the saddle, but the horse continued to ride, dragging him face down. After what felt like forever, his foot became dislodged from the saddle, but his horse did not stop. Catching his breath, he stumbled to his feet, hoping for a swig of tequila, promising himself it would be his last drink. He continued to hear someone calling his name in a sadistic, taunting squeak. Father began to shake involuntarily and felt his heart pounding against his rib cage. "Fight like a man. Show your face," he muttered, trembling, not truly meaning what he said. He'd been hoping it was just a bad dream since no one had answered. Abruptly, he felt its hot breath. Before he could do or see anything, he was picked up and tossed a few yards into the air. Whoever, or whatever that was, had massive strength and knew his name, and that made him question himself. Obviously, it was too much for him to handle. Father felt defeated. He knew of his impending doom. Whatever it was, it couldn't be human. Barely conscious, his terror intensified when he heard a horrific high-pitched howl. My father was beyond terrified, and admitted to almost wetting himself. "If you help me through this, I promise I'll stop drinking," he prayed, in an attempt to bargain with God, but he was barely conscious at this point. His vision went dark, and he collapsed. Waking up, he found himself in a canyon. He was relieved to know he was still alive, but he slowly realized it had not been a dream. He saw his flesh was exposed to the cold wind, and the intensity of the pain throughout his body was excruciating. It was almost dawn, but it was winter, and snowflakes were starting to fall. Moments passed when he started hearing noises nearby. He began to panic. The injured man stumbled to his feet, gathering his bearings, and, without looking back, climbed out of the canyon. Once again, he started making his way home as fast as he could. He knew instantly, recognizing this feeling, that he had been followed. Not just being followed, but being tracked at a great speed. Father was able to feel and hear the creature's noisy breath, only inches behind him. He was petrified but kept moving. Even if he wanted to run, he was too wounded. He almost fainted when he would after that. And he kept good to his word. He quit the liquid courage for good after that.
This happened when I was 10. There were 5 or 6 of us spending the night at my friend Charlie's house. Her parents owned a ranch in the hill country region of Texas, and their home was built on top of a hill. Other than the dirt driveway up to their house, the hill was wild land covered in cedar trees. It was a clear, slightly chilly night in October or November. It's been a few years since I was 10, so bear with me. But after the sun went down, the moon was out, so we stayed out playing hide and seek using the driveway as a base. Their ranch was far enough out the way and well fenced so her parents didn't have a problem with it. Anyway, during one round of hide and seek, me and my friend Gina were the last 2 hidden. We were so good at avoiding being found that the seeker found everyone else, or so we thought, and enlisted their help to find us. We had made it back down the road when 3 of us girls unknowingly cut us off, and we ducked down behind a large ridge of dirt and remained concealed. Gina chucked a rock across the road behind them to divert their attention. We were waiting for them to get far enough off the road to make a dramatic rush for the safety of base, when I heard what sounded like a rock getting dislodged and sliding down the hill behind us. I thought Gina might have done it, so I didn't say anything, but she kind of looked at me and asked if I was okay. I was about to reply when we heard what sounded like one of my friends, Charlie, the one whose house we were staying at, calling from way down the hill behind us. "Help me." We bolted straight up and yelled for the others. They came running to the road and we told them what we heard. No one had seen Charlie since we had started that round of hide and seek. We took them to this spot, where we then hid from them and called out Charlie's name. For a moment all was quiet. Then faintly, even further down the hill, we heard her say, "Help, I'm stuck." We panicked and ran up the driveway as fast as we could to get Charlie's parents. When we burst through the kitchen door ready to yell for her mum and dad, Charlie was sitting at the bar eating a popsicle. "I wondered how long it was going to take for you to find me," she gloated. We all flipped out in the way that only 10-year-old girls can. Her parents heard us freaking out and decided to come down and see what was going on. We told them what happened and her dad grabbed his shotgun and got in the truck, and he went to drive around the ranch, making sure there wasn't anyone on the property who wasn't supposed to be there. But he didn't find anything. I've always wondered what we heard that night. We didn't talk about it much, but I know it remained in all our minds every time we stayed over there past sundown. Does anyone know what it may have been? Especially since other people seem to have heard little girls' voices outdoors. Explanations welcome. When I was a preteen, I went on a bit of a solo hike up the tallest mountain around. This was Central Texas, though, so you can substitute tall hill for mountain to be more accurate. Anyway, I walked and cut through pastures and climbed fences until I climbed up to the top. It was the first time I had done it solo, and it was a lot of zigzag in my route. I sat there enjoying the view for a bit before deciding to come down. Unfortunately, I got turned around and basically came down the wrong side. When I figured out where I was probably 3 or 5 miles from my house if I went straight through the woods, and probably 7 by road. And it was starting to get dark. So I began walking down this dirt road. It was a long way, but I was not too worried as I knew where I was. And all it would take me now was time and effort. I could do that. As I walked, I passed by a cemetery. It was getting quite dark by this point, and I was startled by a truck coming up behind me. It had 2 guys in the truck who just looked like regular country boys, nothing sinister or special. They pulled up beside me and rolled down their window. "Hey, little girlie, you alright? Need a ride?" I measured all this in my mind real quick and decided I would rather stick with what I knew than get into a truck with strangers, even well-meaning ones. I shook my head at them and kept on walking, approaching a corner of the cemetery and a curve in the road. The truck stayed there, shining its lights on me as I trudged to the corner. The corner was pretty open, with a small scattering of trees clustered, but with no real cover or concealment if I did decide I needed to run or hide. On top of that, the cemetery had a high chain-link fence that I doubted my ability to clamber over easily could muster. I started around the corner, and as I did I heard the truck get back into gear and start coming towards me again. Suddenly, fear took over and I bolted to the side of the road as soon as I saw the headlights were coming on me, intending to get behind the trees and let them pass. Instead, I tripped and fell flat into a long rut in the ditch. I immediately stayed still and heard the truck arrive parallel to me on the road and stop again. A spotlight clicked on and immediately among the trees in the ditch. The rut was deep enough and the grass was high enough that I was perfectly hidden from their view. I watched the spotlight slowly pan up across the cemetery, and then I heard one of them say, "Screw this," and with a spray of dirt they disappeared into the dirt. I climbed out and hiked the rest of the way home no problem. And somewhere, to someone, I am a ghost story.
I recently went on a hike with my friend and his mini schnauzer at our local state park. We had gone on the trail several times before. It's very popular with hikers and families. It was late evening and getting dark, so we picked up the pace. Once it was dark enough to not be able to see where we were stepping, I turned on a little flashlight that my mum had given me just that day. She said that she was worried about me walking to my car after my late-night classes, and told me to shine it in someone's face if there was anyone creepy, which I thought was silly. Bringing this flashlight was a total fluke, but I was happy to have it for the increasingly dark hike. We were about a 10-minute walk away from the edge of the forest, where we parked, when we encountered a lone male walking in the same direction as us about 100 yards ahead. He was a Caucasian in his mid-50s wearing non-hiking clothes. He was walking slowly, which was odd, because it was very dark and most hikers on the trail were long gone, and if not, they would be hurrying out of the woods. The man did not have a flashlight in the very dark forest. My finger slipped from the flashlight and it turned off for a few seconds. I turned it back on, and the man had stopped walking and was standing in the path ahead of us. He quickly moved to the side as soon as I turned the light back on, and said something into his cell phone while we continued forward towards him. As we walked by the man standing on the side of the path, our normally friendly dog barked and growled at the man. The only words we heard the man say were, "Ah, she's an ankle biter." He was suddenly not talking on his phone. I shined the flashlight in his direction while we walked by to know where he was located in these extremely dark woods. I had a really weird feeling about him and started jogging away with my friend. We ended up in a full run out the woods. As we were getting back to the car, we saw the man exit the woods maybe a minute after us and walk quickly towards us as we got in our car. He had to have been running because we ran the whole way out the woods and we're in our mid-20s. This guy was significantly older, so it would have required effort to run that far and fast for him. When we got to the car with the man still quickly approaching, I told my friend to floor it, and we got the hell out of there. When my father was in his 20s, he liked to frequent a remote hiking trail that was about a 30-minute drive from his house. This trail was situated on the outskirts of his town and was a popular beauty spot. Although it was a huge tourist attraction at the weekend, it could be extremely quiet during the week. Now this was in the 1960s, when stranger danger wasn't prevalent and he never considered the dangers of being alone in such a remote place. However, this was all about to change in September of 1968, when he took his last ever solo trip to the trail. He had been frequenting it for about 3 months at this point, with little to no incidents. He had done the same routine where he would park up at 5:30 and continue east to take the larger part of the trail, which then looped around and brought him back to the car park at 7:30. This was the summer, and evenings were relatively light until about 8 p.m. My father was particularly strict with his timekeeping because there was little light on the trails, plus the change in temperature hugely decreased at dusk. He was always afraid he would lose his footing or be unable to find his way back to the car, so he always ensured he came back before dark. This particular evening he had arrived later at around 6 p.m. and was surprised to see a tired-looking camper van already in the parking lot. Normally you get a couple of cars that he'd become familiar with, but he had never seen this vehicle before, and something about it just gave him the jitters, but he initially put it down as just never seeing it before. He ignored any red flags that popped up, but decided to take a quicker route to ensure he would be back before dark. He consequently decided to take the trail north, which would save him about 30 minutes. Halfway into his hike, he starts to get the sensation he's being followed. He turns back and expects to see another hiker, but the footpath behind him is empty. He looks around to see if there are any animals or a ranger in view, but he can't see anything. Putting it down to paranoia after seeing the van, he continues, but tries to tune into his environment as best he can, listening for any sound or movement. Deeper into the trail, he becomes more and more uncomfortable and realizes that he is totally alone. He hasn't seen another hiker, and the feeling of being watched hasn't left him. He knows he has another 30 minutes of walking, so turning back wouldn't make any sense. He continues but quickens his pace and tries to rationalize why he's feeling like this, but it's no good, as he still feels like a deer in headlights. As he approaches a bend in the trail, he immediately gets into the fight or flight feeling when he senses he's in immediate danger. He half expects to see someone as he turns the bend, but no one's there. Still absolutely terrified, he decides he needs to hide from whatever or whoever might be out there, so he hides behind some bushes and tries to remain as quiet as possible. A few minutes go by, and nothing. Not a sound, and he starts to convince himself that it is probably safe to continue. He is about to come out of his hiding spot when he can hear shuffling sounds. It's very light, but coming from the direction he came from. He's hoping that it turns out to be a deer or another forest creature, so that he can laugh about it and that he's been afraid of nothing. But he sees the outline of a person. He can only partially see them due to his obstructed view, but senses this is a man with a very broad frame. He's walking slowly and carefully past the bushes, as if he doesn't want to be seen. My father then comes to the realization that it is probably who had been following him, and what set off his warning messages to hide. He quickly ponders what he needs to do. He can't go back in the opposite direction, and it's a good hour of walking and nightfall is approaching. He also doesn't want to continue the remainder of the trail, because he may meet whoever was following him. He considers the possibility of hiding for a bit longer, but that would mean being stuck on the trail in the pitch darkness. Then he realizes where he is. He is about a 10-minute run up to the main road that is situated behind the wooded area where he resides. All he has to do is get to the road, and it's probably another 10 minutes to his car. But it's 10 minutes of being in the open. He may just get away with it. So he waits until he suspects the man is out of view and makes a run for it. 2 minutes into his running, he starts to hear the branches snapping to his right. It's the man from before. He's now pursuing him through the trees. My father manages to outrun the man and makes it safely onto the road, and pauses for a second to catch his breath and then jogs back to the car park, too afraid to look back. On safe arrival to the car, he notices the camper van is still there, but the other cars have since left, leaving him alone. He quickly gets to his car and drives out as fast as he can. As he's pulling out of the road, he looks towards where he had just come from, and the man is just standing in the road. He's staring wide-eyed at my father, with no expression, no movement, just stood there staring. My father drives in the opposite direction, and can see the man just stood in the road, still watching his car as he pulls out of view. My father still has no idea if the man actually meant any harm, but it took him a good long time to return to the trails. He would always take a friend and preferred to go at busier times. He did report the incident to the park rangers, but nothing ever really came from it. I have recently ventured up the trails, just with friends, to confirm that it's not somewhere you would want to be alone.
I live near the Canadian border in central Washington state. More bears than people in my little valley. One afternoon I was walking up the hill near my house and saw, after passing a large tree about 20 feet away, a very large cougar. My estimate for size, probably very accurate. Weight 175 to 190 pounds, Length from nose to tip of tail close to 9 feet. Thick, bulky, male. Muscles on the back of his neck like a large pit bull or breeding bull. Not a scar on him that I could see. No chunks of his ears from previous fights missing. Hair, long, perfect. You could see the muscles rippling through the hair that were 1 to 1.5 to 2 inches. He was coming down the hill and had just stepped from behind a tree of his own. We both froze in our tracks. He was staring at me like I had never been stared at in my life. Intense X-ray vision, never blinking kind of stare. It knocked the wind out of me. We stood there frozen, staring at each other intently for what seemed like 15 to 20 minutes. Neither of us moved. He was slightly higher on the hill looking down at me, maybe 1 or 2 feet taller than I was. He seemed to like that. Neither of us moved. I had a 9mm pistol in my shoulder holster, but I didn't pull it out. I could have very quickly, but probably not quick enough considering they can jump really far. It was a very intense sharpening of the senses and perception, probably the effect of adrenaline. It was like time stood still, and I could count every hair on his face. After 15 minutes or so, to my great relief, he slowly blinked once, still staring. However, the spell had been broken. He took a deep breath and slowly and smoothly turned uphill and walked away at a pretty good clip, never looking back. It's been 3 years now, and I have seen his tracks twice. One of my neighbors got a picture of him from a local trail cam, so he's still there. Sometimes I think he's around, but it's impossible to tell. But I don't know how anyone else would react to that. But for me, it was a very creepy encounter. Because at the same time I realized how lucky I was to have that encounter. I love this place because he's there. The bears too. Had some encounters with them as well, but whatever you think and whatever you've heard, the male cougars in the wilderness are the apex predators in the northern woods. I've seen a whole lot of cougars in zoos. Nothing in a zoo can even come close to this guy. He was the most perfect and terrifying specimen I've ever seen. Supremely confident and dangerous. I was with my older brother, spotting deer a couple of miles from our house. My brother had just started driving a few weeks ago, so we decided to take up my mum's car for a spin. We were on a very narrow and windy dirt road with no streetlights at all. We didn't see any deer, so we were about to leave the area. I heard some twigs or something snapping in the brush, and it sounded no more than a few yards away. Me and my brother both shined our spotlights towards the sound, hoping we would see a deer or turkey, but we saw something that will probably never leave our minds until the day we die. There were over a dozen people standing right in front of us looking at us. We were so scared we just zoomed out of there. We didn't really tell anyone because we were pretty much on private property, but it was terrifying. Just the way all those people were in the woods, standing in the dark with blank faces. It was really creepy. We never went anywhere near that road again. I was hiking deep in a valley on the island of Hawaii. I hit the trail that morning and had gone non-stop for about 7 to 8 hours, stopping only for minor breaks to check my trusty compass. Yes, I still use a compass for hiking. Drinking water or to pick up any trash I find, as my mum had taught me to do so when I was a kid. I'm rounding the clearing of one of the larger and lesser-known waterfalls when I hear a shrill mixture of laughter and trashy rap music coming from a cheap speaker. A group of 5 young adults had taken up residence around the falls and were having a little soiree, which is completely fine, except as I get closer I realize that their camping site is littered with disposable red drinking cups and beer bottles. I pop open the bag I use to haul all the trash I've been finding, and sure enough, most of it is red plastic cups and beer bottles, the same brand they have. I'm 31 and have no problem with youngsters being youngsters, but I can't stand it when people litter back home, especially in the beautiful forest. They hadn't seen me yet, and I didn't want to startle them, so I announced my presence by stepping as loudly as I could. The group eventually turns to silently acknowledge me, and one of them turns down the speaker. I politely introduce myself and make sure they understand I'm not any type of government employee or anything, just a friendly local who loves his home. I showed them my collection of debris that seemed to match theirs and asked if they knew where it came from. This is where it got dicey. Two of the three guys then got pretty agitated and asked me in what I can only assume was an attempt to impress their female companions. Buck up real close to me and turned the testosterone on blast. "Yeah, it's ours. What you gonna do about it?" and all of that. Now, like I said, I'm 31 and really have no desire to needlessly scrap with the idiots in the woods over some garbage. That being said, I completely remember the years of my life where that would have been my one and only reaction to the situation. I remain calm and civil and try my best to sequester the coming violence by offering to take the rest of the trash they have, just so they wouldn't worry about hauling it back down to the start of the trail. All I ask in return was that they try to leave the place just as clean, if not cleaner, than they found it. This argument goes on for 5 to 6 minutes when one of the girls suddenly shrieks and points towards the trees behind me, claiming she just saw someone running in the distance. I've been told that I can be a pretty intimidating guy when I wanna be, but I don't know if it was the liquid courage in their cups or opportunity they saw as I turned to check behind me. And one of the alpha males decides to throw his now empty cup to the back of my head. This causes me to drop my compass and knuckle up for a beating. I take a slow breath and slowly turn back to face him, but not before an audible crack punctures the air, and this guy is on his knees and clasping the back of his head, some blood pooling between his fingers. His friends are panicked and looking at the top of the waterfall where I just barely make out the shadow of a figure against the sunlight before it ducks back beyond a cliff. I'm at a loss for words when I notice what actually struck the kid's head had skidded to a stop by my feet. It was a narrow piece of lava rock that was shaped for use in native Hawaiian war sling, or ma'a. I decided to capitalize on the apparent fear in the group's panicked youth faces and cordially announce, "Maybe it's time for you guys to move on." The group scuttered around hastily, picking up their gear and being sure to grab whatever trash they had without further prompting. The group hops back on the trail just as the distant clamor of branches snapping can be heard from deeper within the valley, which sends them rocketing back through the trees. This logically should have terrified me as well, but something in my gut told me I'll be fine, as long as I'm doing the right thing. I decided to err on the side of caution and follow the group down the trail, but at my own pace, all the while cringing under the feeling that I was being watched the entire time. I heard the occasional twig snap near my peripherals, but refused to take my eyes off the way back. I eventually just get back to my truck just before dusk, when I stopped to realize I left my damn compass on the ground at the falls. As my back's facing the entrance of the trail, and I'm patting down my cargo pockets in hopes that I was wrong, my compass hits the ground between my legs from behind me and rolls a foot or two down the truck before stopping. I damn near crap myself, snatch the compass up, and yell back, "Thank you, sorry," hop in my truck, and piece the hell out of there. Who or whatever it was that followed me to the end of the trail definitely felt it was time for me to move on as well.
A few years back, when I was around the age of 14 and my brother 9, my dad, my little brother and I went out deer hunting in the afternoon right before sundown. While we were walking through the woods, before we even got started, my little brother tugged on my arm and asked me if I saw that. I said it was probably his imagination, and he let go of my arm. A few minutes later, I couldn't hear him walking behind us anymore, and turned around to find he had gone. I quickly told my dad and we looked for him for at least half an hour. When he walked over out of nowhere towards the both of us, he was covered in mud like he'd fallen somewhere. I worriedly asked him where he'd gone, and he just stared at me, telling me he couldn't remember and thought that he had never left. He acted normally afterwards, just as though nothing had happened. I don't know if it's scary to anyone else, but it shook the entire family, including myself, for quite a bit.
I've had some crazy animal encounters with bears and lions. Here's a good cat story. There is a recreational area just outside of Laramie, Wyoming, called Vedauwoo, which is a beautiful forested area with large rocky outcrops and well known to climbers. It's one of the few places in the country where local climbers regularly bring shotguns to the crag. In 2016, at a particularly rocky outcropping known as Reynolds Hill, which is a bit deeper into the Vedauwoo, and a longer hike from the nearest forested road, my then girlfriend and I spent the day climbing and finishing our last route as the sun set. As we gathered our things and hit the trail in the dark, I whistled for my dog but couldn't find him. I flashed my headlamp into the trees and saw a pair of eyes reflecting back at me, about 10 meters away in the trees. At first I thought it was my dog, until I realized those eyes are way too far apart to be my 60-pound dog, and the eyes were much too far above the ground. The distance between them implied a head that was massive. Just then my dog comes out from the same trees and joins us, oblivious to the fact he was being stalked. I flipped my headlamp on to keep light shining on the cat, as cats tend to pounce when you have your back turned to them. For over a mile this thing stalked us, never getting closer than 10 meters, but it was big enough to be a damn scary hike out. 4 years later, in September 2020, my new girlfriend and I with our 2 dogs are climbing Vedauwoo. We meet and befriend a cool couple who have been camped out there climbing for a few months. I told them the story of being stalked coming out of Reynolds Hill, and a couple of days later all 4 of us find ourselves camping and climbing Reynolds Hill. After a late session finishing up that same route from 4 years ago, we begin hiking out in the dark. It's such a deja vu feeling that as we come down the rocks onto the trail, I stop to retell the story, explaining to them, "Hey guys, this is the exact spot where I flashed my light into the trees and saw the eyes." Literally, as I'm recreating the story, I happen to flash my light and catch a pair of eyes reflecting back at us about 15 meters out and up high on a cliff brad. They think I'm messing with them until the cat comes down and gets within 10 meters of us. We proceed to hike out in the dark, and the cat stalks us the entire way out near the trailhead. The trail winds through an aspen grove, and just before we entered it, the cat comes within 5 meters. The previous cat was much bigger, but this cat got way too close. The other guy and I were hiking backwards, eyes and lights on the cat, knife in hand, while our girlfriends were huddled close but hiking forwards. It was sketchy. Crazy how the exact same plot unfolded at the same hill after the same route. I like to imagine it was the original cat's offspring. A couple of days later, my girlfriend actually saw a lion about 30 meters away down the small valley, in a full sprint chasing prey. No one else saw nor heard it. I tend to ask all the climbers I interact with out there if they've seen any cats. Most of them haven't, but if you're keeping a watchful eye, you'll see them out there for sure. The locals know that, and they carry shotguns. This happened last year. I'm a guy in my early 20s and there's a park close to the place I live. You follow this road that goes down to the small river. The road begins in a fairly populated area, and as you go down the river maybe 200 meters, you get to the park near the small river. The park doesn't have any lights, and even though it's surrounded by many residential buildings, it's still isolated with the trees all around like a smaller forest. There's a specific area that I go to when I chill out for a bit. It's at the end of a park, and there's a stone I like to sit on. To get to this area, you have to walk across an open grassy field, and I come here when I want to chill out by myself, have peace of mind, and escape from the everyday madness that life can sometimes be. It was around 10 p.m. and I grabbed my bike, and start riding towards that place. It takes no more than 3 to 5 minutes to get there on a bike, even though it's night and the park is pitch black. I still wanted to go and smoke a cigarette or two near the river in the beautiful nature, so I get there, park my bike next to it, and light up a cig, pull out my phone and watch something on YouTube while enjoying the calmness around me of the sound of flowing water. I spent half hour looking at my phone when I caught a glimpse of something in the dark. I'm getting chills as I remember this. At first I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. It was pitch black after all, and after a few seconds I realized something is actually definitely there, 10 to 15 meters away from me. I got up to get a better look, and noticed that the dark silhouette is slowly approaching, as if to not make a sound, and then it suddenly dropped to the ground. As I saw the movement on the ground, I thought it must be an animal, a raccoon perhaps. Why the hell would a person slowly move towards me and then drop to the ground when I noticed it, right? I turned on the lights on my bicycle and pointed it towards the dark figure. It was not an animal. It was a Middle Eastern man ducking down and staring at me. Now keep in mind I'm at the dead end of a park and no roads lead to here, so you have to get through an open field to arrive. The light of my phone was definitely visible to him. "Hi," I say as soon as the light revealed him. I did this kind of automatically. I guess I was looking for a reaction. I did that just to bust him trying to sneak up on me. "Turn it off," he says. "Why?" "Turn it off." "I'm just gonna leave," I say as I'm getting on my bike, still carefully watching for his movement. As I'm driving away, I'm still looking at him closely. He got up and made a few steps towards the place I was sitting at, then ducked down again. I got far enough away to feel safe and instantly wondered what would have happened if I'd have kept my eyes on the phone for another minute. Guess I won't be chilling at that place anymore, at least not at night. What were his intentions? He definitely was trying to stay quiet in the dark. This is a good reminder that sickos do exist. Be careful out in the woods, everyone.
I have an experience to share with you that happened to me and a group of my very close friends. But before I get into it, I'm going to give you a little bit of context. My name is Tom. I weigh about 160 pounds and stand at 5'11". I'm 25 and love the outdoors so much that I actually started a club in high school called the Outdoor Grizzlies. It was a very small group of us who would set up different hiking trips to go on. We had hiked all the way to the beautiful Sleeping Giant State Park trails of Connecticut, all the way to the Julia Pfeiffer Burns State Park in California, which has a fantastic 80-foot waterfall with a lavish scenery. In this group of my fellow friends are my best friend from middle school, Jake, my good friend I met in freshman year of high school, Jennifer, and Jake's girlfriend since high school, Christine. The four of us were inseparable, and we went on all of our hiking trips together in high school. We held fundraisers, and the school saw how much we loved nature and that we could make a career out of it. So they gladly allow us to take a step further. We were all in shape for the most part, which is why we loved doing what we did. Not only did it free our minds and give us clarity, but it took away some of the anxiety that you often experience as a teenager, as well as depression. Anyway, we, at least, didn't have to go through it very much. As I said, the hiking really helped deal with it. Even our teachers at some point went with us and said that it really helped manage their stress and anxiety too. But after graduating from high school, things sort of died down at the club. We all kept in touch and stuff, as most people in high school do, but life happens. The only one I really spoke to was Jake. He and Christine were still together, but I barely spoke about hiking because it just wasn't in our blood anymore. Jennifer did her own thing, and was seeing a college jock called Robert. And with the exception of Jake, we all drifted for a few years. One evening, In May, I decided it would be nice to throw a bonfire. Just a few close friends. Christine didn't really want to hang around people she didn't know, and she had the bright idea to invite Jennifer. Through the power of social media, it turns out Jennifer was actually very happy and willing to come. She spoke about how life got in the way of her and Robert, and how they broke up. The bonfire would be just what she needed so that we could all catch up and talk about life, and it would be like old times. She said her number was still the same, and said to call her to confirm. It was easier than I thought. Suddenly I was filled with happiness and excitement. It was going to be just like old times. When the bonfire happened, it went off without a hitch. We had a fantastic time. It was around 1:30 a.m. and everyone else had gone. The ones who were left were myself, Jake, Jennifer, and Christine. The cool spring breeze embraced my neck, and the fire kissed my nose, leaving me with goosebumps. Jake had mentioned how peaceful and nostalgic this was, as he downed the tail end of his beer. The energy in the group was so nice, and Jennifer mentioned how I once slipped on a wet rock trying to run away from an unusual bug, which we all nicknamed the bug incident. We all laughed, and Jake said that if only we could relive those days. Christine looked over at Jennifer and said, "Maybe we can't go back, but can relive them." Then, a sudden idea crossed everyone's mind. See, we'd always spoken about going somewhere exotic, and having a huge hike there. That was our dream years ago. But then, the spark of genius filled us all, and we formed a plan to go to Hawaii. Jake's aunt, fortunate for us, was a flight attendant, and I had a rainy day with a generous amount of money. And Jennifer saved money for a trip that she was going to take on her own, and Christine had a decent-sized YouTube following from her makeup channel, and she was sure whatever else she needed she would crowdfund. After 3 weeks, we pooled our finances, and we were able to afford the trip. We were going to stay around the Honolulu area because there was a very well-known hiking place with a beautiful waterfall. We arrived to our destination and decided to be tourists for the first 3 days, leaving the last 3 to hike the area, and the 7th day to get ready to leave. We, however, wanted to take it a step further and wanted to camp out there too. We had done it many times. We were well versed in camping, so we felt like we could take this on no problem. We made our way deeper and deeper into the forest. We saw people along the way, tourists we spoke to, a few friendly locals, and then we began to notice how much more isolated it became. Christine had said that we seemed far away and didn't have any signal on our phones. She bought a compass and a map, so she said we should just find a place around the area that we were in, and we all agreed. We found a beautiful place, almost as if like it were waiting for us. It was on a cliffside looking over almost the entire island. It was at this point we realized just how far we'd hiked, and it was relatively safe. There was a fence made of bamboo, so you couldn't really fall unless you purposefully threw yourself over the fence. But even then there was a big enough rock protruding out so that you wouldn't fall. It was the most magnificent view I'd ever seen. We set up the tent we had, and some lanterns around a fire to keep away the insects. Jennifer and Christine wanted to explore nearby to see if there was anything here, while Jake and I were setting everything up, when we hear the girls call out, "Hey, we found a clearing and some bushes. Oh, and there are stairs." I thought they were joking. When we went over to look, we saw they were pretty worn, and they led to a piece of rock on the bottom. To put it into better perspective, if you imagine Pride Rock from The Lion King, we were standing on the flat piece, then imagine another flat piece on the bottom. but then there are stairs wrapping around to connect the two. Jennifer was against going down the worn steps because she was afraid that someone may get hurt. But we had to know what was down there, and Jake and I said that we would go while the girls stayed, from their own choice. They were made of stone and were worn, but when we got to the middle it wasn't actually that bad. We finally got down and saw that it was a piece of rock which we were standing on the upper level. It was like a cave underneath. We made our way in, and we could hear the footsteps of crushing broken coconut shells and sand grit as we walked. Jake took his flashlight and lit up the inside. We were amazed. There seemed to be drawings on the walls on what looked like a burial site. It looked disturbed, but the drawings had us intrigued. I lit my flashlight and pointed it to the wall. We were able to make out bodies and very tiny heads. The walls looked untouched. We carefully swept the debris from the wall. We needed more light to understand the carvings, and we called the girls to come down, who did so with reluctance. We asked them to light their flashlights and point at the wall. We all did the same, and they were amazed. We took pictures and agreed to inform the information desk of this place when we were leaving. Maybe we had discovered something that had been forgotten to time. Then Christine said that the carvings told a sequence of events from right to left. As we looked, it just looked like a figure being pushed off a ledge. It was at this point that we got chills and decided to head back up. Jake broke the silence and said that, remember, the carvings are probably from thousands of years ago. It was just history. But we agreed that it was still creepy, and that if it were to rain, we would seek refuge in the cave, but that would be a last resort. We opted to go look around not too far from the campsite, but just exploring. We were all inspired since we stumbled across the carvings on the wall. Perhaps we would be fortunate enough to find something else. We were about 15 minutes into the walk when we realized the sun was beginning to set, and Christine said that we should probably head back, that we didn't want to get caught out in the dark, as it would obviously make things harder for us while trying to get back to the camp. As we were heading back, we heard rustling and sticks breaking. Christine grabbed Jake, and Jennifer locked arms with mine. We thought it was an animal, and braced ourselves in the defensive just in case, when suddenly the large leaves parted, and what appeared to be a native Hawaiian man with a straw hat and a touristy-looking shirt emerged from the bushes. He asked why we were here. We explained we were hikers, and that we have a campsite not too far from the rock, and told him about the strange carvings we saw on the wall. His eyes widened, and they felt like they pierced our very souls. He said he would give us a little bit of advice, and the advice consisted of pack up and leave, that bad things happen here, and that a curse had been placed on the area, and that we should go. We all asked why. The man stared at us before saying, "The night marches." He then said that Bo approaches, and to get somewhere safe, and to never look at them in the eye. With that final cryptic message, he went off. We all looked at one another. Jake said, "Did we really come all this way to leave?" We decided it was only going to be one night, and dusk was approaching soon, as the morning comes, and we'll just pack and leave. We didn't want to touch anything. So we made our way back to the campsite, and when we finally got back, Jennifer remembered that she bought a pot and 2 cans of clam chowder with pita bread. We lit the fire and enjoyed a reasonable dinner. It was one of the best nights we had since our high school days. Christine looked at her watch and noticed it was 1:45 a.m. I'll never forget the time, because it was the night from hell. We decided to get ourselves ready to sleep. 2 people could fit in one tent, and since it was so beautiful outside, Jennifer and I opted to admire the stars and lay out and fall asleep under them. I remember thinking to myself, I only see skies like this on wallpaper for my computer. It was so magical I dozed off. I remember waking up to use the bathroom. There was really no bathroom, so I decided to go into the woods. It was silent. There were no animals making noises, no insects, nothing. It was eerie quiet. It was as if time had stopped. I quietly walked behind the tent into some bushes to release, when suddenly I heard a horn. I'm not sure what it was, but it sounded like a horn. I just passed it off as me hallucinating and headed back to sleep. Suddenly, as I was drifting off, I heard what sounded like a drum. My finger tapped the ground to the beat of the drum as it began to get louder. Jake awoke and peeked outside the tent and looked at me. "How do you have service, man? Turn it down." I told Jake it wasn't me. Now, if you knew Jake, he could be very serious and would only call me by my full name in these situations. "Thomas, stop joking around and go to bed, yeah? You know we gotta get up early." He rubbed his eyes looking at his Apple Watch. Suddenly a horn noise went off again. This time, louder. Jennifer sat up. Suddenly, the drum was even closer. Christine was still fast asleep. That's when it dawned on us that the sounds were coming from all around us, and we felt cornered as they got closer. We were frozen, and we made a plan to leave. Jake went back into the tent, and you could hear him whisper to Christine. I was trying to gather our things, and I motioned to Jennifer to grab her bag, but she was just staring behind me. I had a sickening feeling in the pit of my stomach. I turned around to look, while I could hear Jake gathering his things in the tent. My fight or flight kicked in, as my head slowly turned. That is when I saw a man standing at least 6 foot tall, with a machete. But that wasn't the frightening part. It was his head. It was very small. He had what appeared to be a coconut for a head, or at least it was covering what was his head, and it was no bigger than a coconut. We were all frozen in fear. I immediately pushed Jennifer away from looking at the monster, and she snapped out of it, grabbed me, and we ran, with Jake and Christine following. We had no idea in which direction we were going, we simply ran. We left all our possessions and heard footsteps and branches breaking, like there were at least 10 or more of them chasing after us. I don't know how we got through the forest. Christine noticed a strong river of water and figured that we could lose them if we crossed. We all jumped and began making our way through, but it kept getting deeper, and before we knew it, the river had overpowered us and carried us away. We looked back and saw 5 of them at the riverbank, with various weapons in their hand. They were no longer following us, simply staring. That moment will be etched into my head for as long as I live. The look of them at the riverbank as we were slowly departing. I don't think I'll ever forget the beings with average height but small heads, and I ended up passing out. I woke up with the sun in my face and Christine hitting me. She had a gash on her head, and Jake and the rest of us were covered in scratches and bruises. Before we could even talk, we heard a helicopter over our heads. They airlifted us to the island nursing triage to get checked out. I asked them how they found us. Apparently an Apple Watch ping sent the coordinates at 4:55, and they'd been searching for us for 4 hours. Christine just cried, and Jennifer hugged her. Jake and I looked at one another. The guy added that we should never have been there anyway. The local authorities came to speak with us and asked what happened, and we told them about the drawings and the men with the small heads. They went on to explain it was just folklore, but people get so frightened with the night marchers that they end their lives, because their minds can't take what they see. They had only 2 instances of documented suicides, one from a 19-year-old girl who jumped off the rock cliff that we were camping at, and the other person they called off the search for because authorities refused to search when night approaches. The area was closed off to the public when they found 4 headless bodies in the 1980s, and perpetrators were never found. He continued that we must have been way off the trail to be at that rocky area because it's completely closed off. They seemed puzzled with how we even got there to begin with. I had chills running down my spine. What the hell did we see? Was it even a head at all? How could they have breathed or seen anything with the coconut covering them? I asked if the night marchers have heads. He said, since we're alive to tell their tale, they didn't remove their coconut shell. But had we died and jumped off the cliff like the young girl, we would have apparently known the answer. After this, we decided to take a very long break from hiking or camping and just met up at a bar. The 4 of us don't really talk about this anymore. I'm sure it's to no one's surprise. It almost ended our friendship. But I'm glad now that after 4 years, we can sort of move past it. When I was a teenager, I used to sneak out of my house at night quite often. Sometimes just to ride my bike around, occasionally to meet up with friends that lived nearby. I live in a fairly suburban area, but with some decent stretches of forest road that would probably creep out some people. I wasn't bothered because of how frequently I was out at night, but I probably would be now. It was around this time of year, and where I live, that means it was very cold. I was supposed to meet up with a friend of mine, who lives about a mile away in a cul-de-sac neighborhood, and although he had stopped answering his phone because he fell asleep, regardless, I decided to head towards his house anyway, in case he woke up. We had planned a meeting time already. I was walking on a dark stretch of road at the beginning of his neighborhood, which has no houses, which I suspect is for drainage reasons, because while there are trees on the left, there is a recess clearing to my right, bigger than a football field, which is covered in thick brush. So I'm walking with my face halfway in my jacket due to the cold, and I'm looking at my feet as I walk. I'm approaching the only street light in sight, at which point I decide to look up and almost crap myself, because there's a deer standing directly in the road under the light, and even though I know deer are basically harmless, I'm still shocked, because I damn near walked into it. It's just standing there, the deer looking directly at me, and before I can react, I hear the roar, a sound only a wild cat would make. Some type of feline beast pounces out of the brush and bites this thing right on the neck, taking it down to the pavement. It looks up at me, and is so close it could have easily attacked me as well, or even instead of the deer. In some lightning speed decision making, I figure this thing has enough food and is probably not interested in eating me as well. And that, the best thing to do, is to run all the way back to my house as fast as possible. I didn't sneak out anymore after that. Almost every time I tell this story, people assume I was high or drunk and fabricated the whole thing because why would anyone else sneak out on a school night or do anything like that? I don't know why. Teenagers are weird. And even though I was dead sober, it was probably not by choice. I never figured out what kind of cat it was. And as you can imagine, I tried staying at home a bit more often after that.
I was once chased by a pack of wolves for a very long time. Felt like an entire day, but it was more like 2 hours at most through the Alps during and after nightfall. The terrain continually switched from steep open areas to thickly wooded hangs. Inside the forest, it was almost entirely dark. I stopped being able to see them and only heard their sounds of communication with others. Growls, which I'm sure were meant for me. Whines and huffing. The movement of their bodies behind and beside me. It was the most terrifying thing, more so than when I had been able to see them before dark. I had no weapon aside from branches, which I had to abandon occasionally to make it down the steep bits without falling to death. I injured my ankle trying to get across a stone-pocketed stream, and my backpack got stuck in some barbed wire a little later. I almost ripped the entire fence along with me. Only when I took a deep breath and collected my leftover chill, it unhooked like it was nothing. Shortly after, the noises left all of a sudden, and 5 minutes later I was standing on the nearest road and made my way to the village, heart still beating frantically, eyes still wandering left and right, ears peaked like a rabbit at dawn. Tell you what, during this entire experience, I don't think once about all the pretty little problems and dramas I had been facing at that point. I don't think I even thought at all. I acted purely on autopilot. Hell, I didn't even exist, if that makes sense. These animals taught me a whole lot of respect and presence for my surroundings and experiences in life. I spoke with wildlife personnel that day after, and was explained that the pack wasn't looking for a snack, but they were most likely trying to get me out their territory. Fair enough, wolves, I get you, and thanks for not taking a bite out of this young, full-headed lady who didn't even weigh more than 51 kilos at that point. I've traveled a lot in my short lifespan, and a shaman I got to know once gifted me a necklace holding a wolf tooth from one of the wolves he had raised. He didn't say much about it, only giving me a knowing smile. I'd been wearing it for years before my experience in the Alps, and it always kind of made me feel protected. Friends would always comment on my fingers playing with it absent-mindedly. That day in the Alps, I crouched in front of the forest a bit, back towards the trees, eyes overlooking the sunshine down in the valley before me. Mountains surrounded my view, their tips tinted in the softest shade of pink, and I felt peace and freedom from my deepest core, when I found myself playing with the wolf tooth around my neck, and jokingly thought to myself, I wonder why I haven't met any wolves on my travels yet. 5 seconds later, I heard a growl so deep, so close behind me, I'll never forget it. That's when I turned around and the rest of the story began. Coincidence or not, either way, one hell of an experience. Although personally, I've seen far worse from angry kangaroos and annoyed boars. But those are stories for another day. This past winter, I hiked one of the high peaks in the ADKs with a buddy of mine and camped out overnight. Everything was fine the entire first day we were there, had a great night's sleep and woke up early to hike back to the parking area. On my way back down the trail, my friend and I noticed that someone had been hiking as well. About a mile after walking, I stopped and saw that my full name, first and last, were drawn in the snow on the side of the footpath. I didn't do it, neither did my friend. It was snowing a bit throughout the night, and it looked as if it had been drawn the day before. The snow would have covered it up. We got a bit freaked out and decided to hustle back to our car so that we can get the hell out of there. We finally get back to the parking area, and I go to sign myself out of the registry book. When I turn the page to where I signed in, I see someone had scribbled out all of my information to where you couldn't read it anymore. No one else had signed in the book beside myself for 3 days. I will not be going back there. Sometimes I see weird things when I walk my dogs. This time I took them to some little forest that's not too far from home. Usually this forest is very quiet, and there aren't many people around, which is why I enjoy going. On this particular day, my dogs started to bark at something. I didn't pay too much attention to it until they ran towards the thing they were barking at. I ran after them in case it was a person or some animal that was causing them so much distress, but they suddenly stopped at some huge bushes, and the barking ceased. The first thing I noticed was this bad smell of something rotten, and the presence of a lot of flies nearby. I wanted to investigate, so I took a look around the big bush, and what I found wasn't what I expected. I thought it would be a dead animal, but instead I found this huge bundle. It looked more like a sack, and it was tied up with a very large rope. At that time I didn't think too much of it. I thought it was some cow that died and its lazy owner left the body there inside the sack. But why would someone do that? It really didn't make sense at all. I moved it with some large stick, and that caused a cacophony of flies to come emerging from it. But that smell, the awful rotting smell, stuck in my nose. The barking began again, but I didn't find anything, so I carried on. I returned a week later. I tried to stay away, but my curiosity got the better of me, and I went back to investigate. This time there were more flies than the last, and someone moved it not too far from the bush, trying to dig a hole where it was originally. The sack was covering up with some dirt. I didn't notice anything else, but it was strange. Why would someone move it? I leaned down and saw the sack was broken, and I could see what's inside. It looked like a head but had no skin. It was brown with no hair. I panicked, because I realized that the thing inside was no farm animal. It looked like a human in the fetal position. I took my dogs and ran home as fast as I could. I wanted to call the cops, but when I got there my family wanted to be sure, and we returned there, but strangely enough by the time we arrived the sack was gone, and half the hole under the bush was filled with dirt again. I think someone was watching me and saw me snooping around. We didn't end up calling the police. Why would they believe me? There was no evidence. It was very creepy though.
I am a local to this South Jersey area, Pine Barrens and all. I hunt and fish on the regular, and my house is in the woods. I'm used to the sounds and things that regularly happen around New Jersey. I've had two experiences that I could never grasp an explanation for that still give me chills. The first one? It was a cold 6-day firearms season, and it was opening day. I had set my stand up in a new spot a little bit further than my previous year. I'm following my bright eyes, reflectors, to get to my stand, and it's pitch black and cold. I'm saying -4 with the wind. Not common in New Jersey, so it's already eerie as I'm walking through the pines, and I get about 25 yards from my tree when I stop to light a cigarette before I go up. As I'm standing there a mile deep in the pine barrens alone in the dark, I hear a grunt. Not a deer grunt, a full-blown snarl. It stops and goes on for a minute or two. At this point my shotgun is stacked to the rim, and I'm looking towards the noise. It charges me, gets about 10 yards out, and I shot once, hitting to the left of it. This sent it off into the darkness. So I figured, get in your tree now. So I booked it. I was about 10 yards away from my tree, and I get charged again, this time from the back, thrusting me to the ground. I went face down in delusion. Whatever it was had hit me and kept going. I stayed in my tree until 10 a.m. when it was bright out. My only description of the thing would be a hog mixed with a goat. It was terrifying, and by the way, we don't have any wild boar here. Now for the second story. I fish the Great Egg Harbor River regularly, especially striper fishing, which just so happens to land in the fall, which is cold. I walk a trail that used to go to an old shipbuilder's manufacturer on the river. I fish the old structure. Bass love the structure. However, there is still a remaining building that's standing. Not bad until you go in. So one day, me and a friend of mine are going to catch the outgoing tide. We load the truck, drove to the trail and hiked about a mile. We get down and set up. The conditions are perfect. However, about an hour in, the rain came. And when it comes, we knew it was going to pour. So we packed our stuff and headed for the building. Once inside, we set our stuff down and figured, screw it, let's just chill for a bit and explore the rooms. Bad idea. It gets creepy in the storm. So we walk up to the second floor where there was a line of rooms on the right and a balcony on the left overlooking the building. As we approached the first door, my friend regretted it. He didn't want to go in anymore,
and immediately turned around with a big no. I like exploring, so I kept on going. I checked the first room to find nothing spectacular, and kept walking, checking the rooms one by one. And I get to the second to last one, and I got this weird sensation in my body, almost like I'd received the worst news of my life. I broke down. Once I got it together, I boogied downstairs where I found that my friend had left and already headed for the truck, leaving all of his fishing equipment. So I grabbed everything and ran out, but I had to run back to grab my rod holder that I was using as a bum defense. As I looked at the second-story window, I saw a child standing there. It was the scariest moment of my life, and I will never go fishing there again.
Perhaps to others, this following thing will not sound that scary, but given the context, perhaps you'll understand why I was a bit frightened at the time. I go for runs early in the morning. On one morning in particular, it's 5 a.m. and it was misty. I'm running with a flashlight strapped to my head. Suddenly, around the corner of this trail, remember, early morning, 5 a.m., a whole group of fully packed men in camo run past me. The local university ROTC program was doing a morning run in full heavy backpack. They run with no lights, and in the mist, it felt like something out of a World War II movie.
My friends and I were determined to make it to a certain spot before setting up camp, so we were out well beyond dark, which I don't recommend for anyone who isn't experienced, and even then, what we were doing was probably dumb. There are 3 of us walking up this trail, when all of a sudden the guy in front of us says, "Oh crap," and we all freeze. Ahead of us in the dark is a pair of glowing eyes, locked onto the 3 of us. The eyes lower, while staring right at us, and it looked like a cougar was getting ready to jump. We are in eastern Oregon, and cougars are in the area. We take a few steps towards forward to see if we can get more lights on it while grabbing some bear spray. Once we get a few steps forward, we see it's just a deer that lowered its head to eat while still staring at us. Phew! We set up our spot, camp, go summit a peak and hike back down to the car the next day. In the same exact spot that we saw the deer, we found its carcass, ripped to shreds and body. It had been maybe 12 hours since we were last there. We were still pretty sure there was a cougar watching us that night. We just couldn't see it. It still messes with me sometimes when I'm out in the country for a few days. I was bushwalking in New South Wales, Australia. Me and my friend come across this weird platform-looking thing made out of rocks. Later that year, the cops arrest some bloke on suspicion of the murders of a series of backpackers who had gone missing over the course of a few years, and at the sites of several of the murders slightly off in the bush were these altars. Current Affairs shows footage of one. The trail and run up to it were all over the news. And yeah, it's the one we found. The altars were typically no more than 300 yards from the victim's shallow graves. The guy who was arrested and subsequently convicted for the murders is Ivan Milat, Australia's worst serial killer. The cops are pretty sure that at least one other person was involved in the murders than the one now in jail for the crime, but they just can't prove it. About 3 years ago, I was walking up a trail with my wife, who was kind of sensitive to the paranormal. She was the first to get a weird feeling about the part of the woods we wandered in, and it took me a bit longer before the gut feeling kicked in. We decided to ignore it and push forwards, thinking there was probably an animal nearby, and we're just freaking ourselves out. We get another 100 yards or so down the trail, and I feel this burning on my back, and we decide to go back home. We get home, and I take my shorts off to find 3 long claw marks going down my back. She sages me and sprinkles this oil stuff on me and the scratches go away. About this time last year, I was hiking up a trail through some old native land known to have burial mounds visible from the trail. I get walking a good ways down the trail to catch something out of the corner of my eye, standing on top of one of the grave mounds, but it's gone when I turn to look. For another half-mile or so, I feel there's something watching me, and I swear I've been hearing soft whistles coming from the woods all around the trail, so I decide to whistle back. No sooner than I finish my whistle, a rock comes flying past my head, bouncing off a tree beside me, and I've stopped going into the woods since then. We used to catch fish in my grandparents' cabin near the Canadian border, and we would have a dumping ground for the guts of the fish we'd caught. This was probably 250 yards into the woods, far away from the cabin so we wouldn't attract bears or other scavengers near our place where we were staying. I was 11 years old and was tasked with dumping the guts. It was dusk and I headed into the woods when I took a wrong turn and realized this and headed back to the main trail, when all of a sudden it was getting dark. I didn't have a flashlight or phone on me, so I kept walking down the trail and I find the dumping ground. So here I am, it's almost pitch black except for the moon, and I smell rotting fish guts when I hear a large animal probably 20 feet away from me in the woods. I slowly walk down the trail, and when I get on the main road, I book it back to my cabin. The next day, we find cougar tracks at the fish dumping ground. To this day, I'm terrified of the woods at night. It was a seriously traumatic experience.
I was mountain biking. I have a few LED lights for night riding, a wide floodlight on my handlebars, and a narrow beam spotlight on my helmet. I'm in Florida, and was riding through a swampy jungle when I noticed the trail was covered with these little sparkly emerald green shiny things. I assumed they were quartz crystals or something, except the trails were mostly sand, and shouldn't have anything like that. So I decided to stop and see what the reflection was, and it was light reflecting back from the eyes of a giant wolf spider. The trail was literally covered with spiders, hundreds and hundreds of them, and these were the ones that were facing me. Another time on the same trail, I was flying down a long straightway, and up ahead I see a pair of eyes reflecting on the trail back at me. They were low to the ground, and I thought they were a raccoon or a possum or something. As I got closer, they started to rise up, and got up, and some more, until they were, it seemed, as tall as a person. Just as the creature got into range of my spotlight, it turned around and bolted into the trees. I only saw its back in my spotlight for a moment, but whatever it was big and covered in medium brown fur. I'm guessing it was a deer, but I'm not entirely sure given the shape. But as you can imagine, I wasn't going to stick around and find out.
A few of us were hiking around the Blue Nile Falls in Ethiopia. After a long day walking, we made it along the valley, hot, sweaty, and looking forward to feeling the cool air of the falls. We're hopping over rocks and making our way across the floodplain, when a shepherd starts screaming at us to stop. I jump the gap over some large rocks and look down to see a snake pit as I jump. The diameter of the moving snake is that of a car wheel. Trying to backtrack with the biggest case of Elvis legs was the hardest part. I spent a week with the Schur family in the Amazon, about 15 miles from Chone, Ecuador. Little background. 3 of us gringo medical/pre-medical students were staying with them on a medical educational rotation, learning about traditional remedies. It was a blast. We stayed in a separate shelter from the family, and the walls of our shelter were decorated with giant snake skins and tigre skins. Those beasts had to have wandered too close to camp over the years. The jungle is a loud place to sleep. Millions of animals and insects clamor all night long, and it blends into a sort of peaceful cacophony. after a gunshot rang out at 3 a.m. The cacophony was gone. Absolute silence reigned. It was the scariest sound I've ever heard. We clung to my 2-inch knife, telling ourselves it would protect us from whatever was coming. We cowered across the entrance to our shelter, awaiting what was to come, certain a tiger was lurking, or that our lovely hosts had decided they were sick of us, and we sat and shivered through the night. The silence was terrifying. When the sun rose, we finally felt confident enough to venture outside. It turned out an unlucky capybara wandered through camp during the night. Poor little bugger got shot in the face at 3 a.m. and it was the first meat we'd eaten all week by 7 a.m. Tasted like greasy venison. I'll never forget that night, or the lovely family. I was about 17, and my friend came round to tutor me in calculus at 10 p.m. at night. I let my friend drive my car to his house. He lived out in the outskirts of town where there's nothing but orchards of almonds. Passed by cattle ranches with lots of lights, silence in the car. I'm on shotgun. I see a bull running on 2 legs like a human. The bull turns and heads towards us, eyes glowing red. It looks like it's ready to spin around, but then evaporates. I look towards my friend and ask if he saw that. My friend replies, "Did it look like a bull running on 2 legs with glowing red eyes and vanished? Yeah, I saw that." That was about 10 years ago. My co-worker came in the next day off work just to tell his friend the exact same story 6 years after my incident. My ex was also in the car but didn't see anything and was on her cell phone. I wonder what it was. People have commented Wendigo or Skinwalker. What do you guys think?
I have a rather big forest near my home. There's nothing special about it, neither creepy nor mystical, and not pretty either, just a forest with trees and bushes and so on. I used to go there a lot with my dog since it was conveniently close and he could run around on it while I was minding my own business. Around 2 or 3 years ago I went there rather late, at around 9 p.m, where it started to get dark soon, but I still wanted to go for a short walk. I always stay on track so I do not disturb any wildlife or damage the plants. As it's getting later and later, I'm somewhat in the middle of the woods, but I feel all good. I know every small track there, and I would always find my way back home. As I'm walking, I hear some weird noises rather close to my left. I couldn't make out what it was, but it was definitely nothing I've ever heard before. It didn't sound like anything earthly, as stupid as that may sound. Then, my dog comes bursting out of the bushes, his tail clamped between his legs, totally focused on me and desperate to get going. He knew there was something weird going on. As I try to calm him, I take a look into the woods, and there, maybe 20 meters from me, I see a pair of deep red eyes staring at me. No movement, no blinking, no anything. They just stare right at me. I'm struck, and somehow can't really move, but I keep staring into those eyes. They were seriously red. I don't know how to describe it, but again, nothing I have seen before. I knew that something there didn't belong, but I didn't know what it was. It was almost like I was dreaming. A very eerie feeling was in the air. It was dry and crisp as hell. And I also felt really calm for some reason, and just told my dog to follow me, and backed away slowly. I never looked back, but I know for sure if I had looked, the eyes would have still been staring at me. After a few meters, I suddenly woke up from my trance-like state, and it just hit me. And I begin full speed running with my dog through that forest, scared out of my mind. I'm crying big time while I'm running. I don't even know why, and what really happened. But everything just felt so freaking wrong, and I wanted to get as far away from there as possible. To this day, I don't know what I saw there that night, and I don't think I really want to find out. The only animals that live in that forest are deer and boars, but the eyes were at human face height, something between 1.5 meters to 2 meters. I never stepped foot into that forest again. It is now the territory of the unknown cryptid, but I haven't heard from anything weird going on down there either. I just want to make sure you understand, I didn't do any drugs or comparable things before going in. I'm pretty sure something weird or downright disturbing would have happened to me had I stayed in the forest.
I was around 19 and had gone camping with two of my buddies in Central Oregon. Very remote type of place, taking hours of driving just to get to the trailhead. It was a 3-day backpacking excursion, or at least that is what we had intended. We were young and inexperienced and wound up getting lost on the second day. It took us 4 days to find our way out of the dense growth. Incidentally, we stumbled into a deserted mining town by accident, which gave us our bearings. We rationed our provisions, so we were far from a dire predicament in this regard. And it was mid-August, so the elements did not impact us too adversely. So far, nothing creepy about it, but when that happened in the 4th night of our trip is something that will not escape me soon. By this point, we were growing pretty concerned at our situation, as the entire day had been spent trying to find our way out of the woods. We had settled into a camp for the night, wary and anxious. Our fire was dying out, so we threw in a few more hunks of wood and climbed into our tents in the hopes of catching some much-needed sleep. I can't be sure who woke up first, but it was either me or one of my friends. I can't describe exactly what woke us, but what we heard next was something that sounded like a telegraph or perhaps an old typewriter. It was faint but with an unmistakably clear cadence of seemingly random clicks and taps. I poked my head out of the booth to find both of my friends wide-eyed, staring. We were definitely all hearing it, but no one said a word. The fire was smouldering and ashing, and the sky was overcast so we couldn't see beyond our tents. The sound was faint and hard to pinpoint, but in my mind, I kept trying to rationalize the sound being a squirrel or a woodpecker. Before any of us had a chance to say anything, a new sound could be heard. It was distinctly more faint, but undeniably not an unnatural sound that you would hear in the middle of the woods dozens of miles away from the nearest town. When we heard it, the noise that sounded like the transmission you hear between NASA flight control and astronauts in outer space, overlaid with music that sounded like orchestra. A high-pitched beeping sound, music, static, silence, unintelligible words being spoken by a male voice, more static, high-pitched beeps, silence, music, static. The beep had a resonating echo. The static would go on for a minute at a time, broken by bouts of short silence. We were lost in it. The air was a thick damp, and I could feel the gravelly sound scraping against my senses. I recall my hand was trembling when I looked down. The whole ordeal lasted maybe half hour, but in a court of law I'd swear it was hours. None of us rested the rest of the night. We wandered aimlessly around the next day, tired and dazzled, growing increasingly terrified of the darkness that approached. Neither of us spoke of the incident after the trip. We never made any pact or anything corny, we just ignored it. And before anyone asks, we weren't high or tripping anything. We hadn't even packed any alcohol. We were completely sober. I'm 28 now and have lost touch with my two buddies from that trip, though I thought I found one of them was a KIA in Iraq last year. I still have dreams about that night, because they aren't necessarily as horrifying as they are incredibly rare. I remember this like it was yesterday, because for me, it was. July 22nd, 2011, I had just gotten married to my beautiful wife at the beginning of the month. I was 34 years old. Have you ever written your thoughts down knowing you're legally dead? Neither have I until now. Like I said, it was July 2011. I'd only been married a few weeks, and one day while my wife took a nap, I decided to take a walk. Right across from my house, across the street, is nothing but woods. According to Google Earth, the woods can go on for a while. I may have been walking between 30 to 45 minutes when I heard a noise. I'm not the kind of guy who believes in ghosts nor Bigfoot, and I'm not worried about other people because I always carry something with me to protect me, and I'm not easily scared. The noise I heard wasn't like a twig snapping, leaves crunching, or a rock falling. It was more of a splash. So I followed the sound and it led me to a small clearing. I saw a creek, but the water wasn't clear like you normally see. Instead, it was a light greenish color. It had a glow and fog rose from it. It was like nothing I had ever seen before in person, only in horror or sci-fi movies. As I looked at the creek and all of its weird wonders, I heard the splash again. I followed the sound with my eyes and saw a downed tree, and saw part of a person's left hand. I immediately ran over and dropped to my knees to help this guy. What I saw next still sticks with me to this day. As the guy raised his head in what I thought was to take a breath, he cut his eyes at me. Halfway still in the water, a smile formed on his face. Just as fast as I saw him, he was gone. He vanished into thin air. Gone. No trace of him at all. Then in what I'm guessing was an hour, I woke up. And I know what you're thinking, it was all just a dream. But wait, I was still in the same spot. I fell asleep in the same spot this guy was in. I jumped up, still feeling a bit dazed, and headed home. A million things were running through my mind, knowing my wife was not going to believe what just happened to me. I just knew I was going to be in trouble. I finally make it home and try to open the door, but my key wouldn't work. Okay, that's weird, I thought. Suddenly, a guy opens the door and asks, "Can I help you?" Keep in mind, I've never seen this guy before. I ask him who he was, why he was in my house, and where my wife was. Looking confused, he answers, "Son, we've lived in this house for 8 years. Even more confused, I asked, "What do you mean? My wife and I bought this house earlier this month." After this time, a woman walks up to him, and I can only assume it's his wife, and whispers something in his ear. About the same time, a cop was pulling into the driveway, and I'm guessing that's what she was telling him, that she had called the police. They took my wallet, knife, gun, and placed it all on the hood of the squad car. The police questioned me and the other guy separately, comparing our stories in just as much confusion as we had. The other guy gave the police all the proper paperwork to prove his side, and was released to go back into his home. All of the attention was then turned back to me. I told them I wasn't crazy. I just looked in my wallet and told them to look in my ID, and took the serial number on my gun, and that I wouldn't lie. They opened my wallet and laid everything out. There was nothing but old newspaper clippings about nothing in particular, and there was no ID there. The serial number on the gun came back clean. It was not stolen, but there was also no name of the owner found either. Frustrated, I told them it's been a long day. Can you drive me to my father-in-law's house so he can clear this up? The police officers looked at each other, then back at me and said sure. 15 minutes later, we pull into my father-in-law's driveway. A smile came across my face and I breathed a sigh of relief, like a brick was taken off my chest. Everything was as I explained it to the officers, and soon everything was going to be okay. One of the officers knocked on my father-in-law's door to talk to him, and the other officer and I waited outside. A few minutes later, the officer and my father-in-law walked outside to join us. My father-in-law looked at me with a tear in his eye and said, "Sir, this officer told me everything that's going on. I can't imagine what you're going through, and I don't know how to tell you this, but I don't know you or how you know these things about me or what kind of sick game this is, but I need you to leave." My heart sank. What in the world was going on? The officers apologized, thanked him for his time, and we left. I asked where we were going, and they replied, "To the station to figure this out." I begged them for one last try and asked to call my dad. If anyone could make sense of this, it was going to be him. I gave him my dad's info, his name and number, the whole 9 yards. They pulled over and called him and told him everything, and you could hear my dad yelling. He definitely wasn't happy, and he too thought this was nothing but a sick joke. He screamed he had no idea who this guy was or how he knew me, and that the only son he ever had, his ex-wife, miscarried 30 years ago, and that he suffers with that loss daily, and that it was sick and twisted for us to be calling him. There were a few choice words screamed as well as he hung up. So I sit here in this mental hospital, whatever you call it, nothing more than a John Doe. I'm not writing this thinking anyone will believe me, because no one else has. I'm sharing this in the hopes that someone will hear this and can help me and will know who I am.
When my friends were 14 or so, they walked up into the woods behind our buddy's house. After walking out into the wilderness for probably half an hour, they came across a well-kept red-headed man. Without saying a word, he began walking at them and proceeded to chase them for about 2 miles, all the way back out of the woods. Once they got back into the clearing, he just turned around and walked back up into the wilderness. I worked with someone who vacationed in Japan and went for an early morning jog. He thought he was in a park, as it was relatively close to his hotel, except it was too nice a park to be a park. And then he was surrounded by an Imperial Guard, like a circle of men with guns wearing uniforms. I guess he somehow found a back way into the palace garden. He wasn't arrested, but laughed at mercilessly. I grew up in a really rural town. It took 15 minutes of driving to get to any sort of establishment. One night when I was around 8 or 9, my friend and I were standing outside in the driveway, waiting for my father to come outside to bring her home. All of a sudden, we hear this rustling around the bushes. Now, it would be strange for a deer to come that close to a few kids fooling around, but we couldn't see what it was, and our first reaction was to figure it must be an animal. It was just an animal until we hear a deep, rough voice go, "Hey." We ran into the house, screaming, and as we got to the door, there was something in our bushes. My father came to investigate, and I was still shaking in my boots. When a drunk man comes wandering out of the bushes, he said he heard us talking, so he thought we could help him. But I'm still confused as to how he managed to get into the bushes in the first place. I was looking at the road that was about half a mile long, and we sent him on his way. And from then on, it was easy to make me jump out of fright when I was alone in the driveway at night. As a kid, my mum was married to a crazy ex-Marine who insisted we live off the grid, so he built this barn. He got the barn lumber from a farmer who wanted his torn down, and he built it quite a ways from the gravel road. The only way in and out was hiking, and as a kid, walking alone through the timber from where we parked the cars into the barn was kind of terrifying. But the weirdest thing I saw was a near silent, flying object going really low to the ground. All I could think about was what the hell was that, and until recently forgot about it. Aliens, perhaps? I have a second story, though. As an adult, I went hiking with my boyfriend on a friend's land that bordered a nature reserve. It was around 2 a.m., and I awoke hearing stomping footsteps outside the tent. I grab my machete and listen. I'm half naked and shaking either from cold or nerves, and the next thing I hear is like a raptor sound from Jurassic Park, when the raptors are communicating. Granted, this is in Iowa. We don't have a large amount of dangerous animals. The stray black bear that usually happens in northern Iowa, maybe a cougar or so, but those are rare. I'm panicking, as I've never heard this kind of noise before, and I've grown up in the woods. Eventually, the stomping steps trail away, and we don't hear anything for the rest of the night. I told my friends about it, and he's like, "I'm pretty sure it was a deer." I'm like, "Well, I've never heard a deer make that noise before." He says that we pissed off the deer because we were in its territory, and then proceeded to play a video of the same sound, and I'm like, holy hell, that came from a deer? And I felt like a real idiot. Every year, me and one of my closest friends, called Dane, go down to visit his grandparents at their cabin in a nice small peaceful town in the North Georgia mountains. Me, my friend, and his grandpa are all outdoorsy kind of people, so we are always looking for something fun to do around the area. One night, we decided to go on a night hike on a trail not too far from the cabin. Now, This isn't the kind of trail you're probably thinking of. It's really just a gravel dirt road, but a lot of hunters, campers, motorbikers and backpackers use it. And right as we pulled up to the trail we're gonna hike on, we noticed an older, beat-up, suspicious-looking black Chevy SUV with two middle-aged men in it parked next to the entrance of the trail. Now, even though this is a safe area, drug deals and other kind of sketchy activities can occur deep in these woods, so we avoided going on that trail and decided to head down to another trail about half a mile down the road. We pulled about 50 or so feet into the trail just outside of view of the road, parked the truck, and got out and started our hike. Our hike was off to a great start, until we got about a mile in, and we started to hear a dog barking from about 300 feet away. We decided to keep going, but the dog would just not stop barking, and we didn't know if the dog was on a leash or not, and could come and attack us, so we decided to turn around and head back. When we were about 1,000 or so feet away from the truck, we could see a car sitting behind my friend's grandpa's truck, running with its headlights on. This instantly made us worried, because who would just roll up behind a random truck at 10 o'clock at night on an isolated trail? And keep in mind, you had had to drive into this trail to see where we parked the truck. It was not visible from the road. We stood there for about 5 minutes trying to see if we could see anybody, but since it was so dark and pretty far away, it was hard to see anything. Fortunately for us, there was a pretty large tree next to the trail, and we were able to stand behind it, so there was no way they could have seen us from where they were parked. My friend's grandpa took these night vision binoculars we had with us to try and get a better look, but it was still not much help. We decided to just stand there and wait for them to turn around and leave, because there was no chance we were going to walk back with this random car with potentially bad people in it sitting behind our truck. After about 10 minutes of just standing there, to my absolute horror, the car drove around the truck and started to head down the trail in our direction. As soon as we could, we climbed up this high hill right next to us and hid behind a log that was sitting on the top. A few seconds later, the same beat-up black Chevy SUV we saw outside the other trail we were originally supposed to hike on comes driving down where we were just standing not 15 seconds prior. The car had rolled its window down and started to slow down as it drove past us. Me, my friend and Grandpa were terrified. Our hearts were pounding out of our chests, and we were scared these guys would stop and sit there, or worse, get out and start looking for us. Fortunately, the car just kept driving and never stopped. As soon as the car was out of sight and we got out of our hiding spot, we booked it back to the truck and got the hell out of there. I know this may not be as scary as some other stories you've heard, but to us it was definitely very frightening. We didn't know who or what those guys wanted. My guess is that they had a stash on that deep trail in the woods, and thought that if we stumbled upon it or something, they would need to confront us, or perhaps end us. A lot of things could have gone wrong. We could have walked up to the truck just as they pulled in. What if they'd have come out and looked for us? What if they'd have slashed our tires? Or what if they turned their headlights off and sat there and waited for us to return? My friend and his grandpa actually went back in the daytime a few days later to the exact spot where we were hiding and took a few pictures. If we got up there just 2 seconds later, we would obviously have been seen. I can only imagine what could have happened if we didn't make it up that hill and those guys saw us. Your guess is as good as mine, but I'm relatively certain it would not have been good.
Mountain climber in the Philippines. One time my group went on a night hike to a mountain located in central Luzon. Naturally, we took the easier trail, North Peak, since we were hiking with some newbies. At around 4 a.m. we broke camp and started our descent. Almost an hour in, we noted that we kept passing the same fallen tree and the same boulder. The trail was very straightforward, and many of us had climbed the mountain before, but for some reason all of us were going in circles. One of the more superstitious hikers decided to make us all stand in a circle, utter a prayer, and leave an offering of food. Only then will we be able to complete our descent. This next story happened in 2015 when I was on a day hike at a Mount GB, somewhere in the southern part of the Luzon area. This week prior to my hike, I was in the same area with a friend. Being that the trail is relatively straightforward, we decided not to hire a guide. Fast forward to the present. I decided to do a nighttime trek with 5 of my colleagues in tow. Since I was the one who knew the trail, I was the group leader. About an hour or so in, we heard something that went "Tst" as we were hiking the trail. We looked around, thinking it might be one of the locals, as some parts of the trail led to small houses. Anyway, it soon stopped, so we forgot all about it. We soon reached a narrow part of the trail bordered by shallow cliffs on either side. Since I was in the lead, I was very focused on the trail and didn't notice that my colleagues were lagging behind until one of them opened up and said, "Hey, why don't you shine your flashlight in front of you?" I stopped walking and waited for them to catch up. When we reached the campsite, I asked my colleague why he told me to shine the flashlight in front of myself. He whispered, "Well, you were walking so fast I didn't think you saw the child standing right in front of you." That creeped me out. On another occasion, me and my 2 other friends were walking on our way home from the summit of a mountain, also in southern Luzon, when a kid came to us asking if he can guide us for 5 pesos. He was dressed in a blue checkered shirt and white pants. He was very well groomed, his clothes were wrinkle-free, and his hairs weren't even messy at all. We knew the trail by heart, so we kept on declining his offer. Eventually we agreed since we figured he would follow us anyway. When we started to walk again, he suddenly stopped following us. I called out to him, but he didn't mind me. He just stood still. I looked at my companions and they were so very scared, so I said, "Okay, stay there if you want, but you won't get your 5 pesos," and left. Now I've told this story to fellow mountaineers and they told me the kid was probably a child of one of the guides. This is a very popular urban legend surrounding a certain mountain called the Devil's Mountain. The famous legend goes there's a story of a couple who went on a hike there at midnight. They got lost when they accidentally took an unusual trail on their way to the campsite. Even if the weather is threatening because of a storm and there was zero visibility, they still continued the hike. They arrived at a point where the trail forked, and they turned left when they should have turned right. The left was a deadly trail, thus they never made it to the campsite. According to local folk, the 2 have only recently been found. Now this next story connects to the previous one, also taking place at said mountain. A group of hikers together with a guide went on a rarely used trail. On the way back they passed a small village, where the elders advised them to continue the trek but leave the only girl in the group at the village. They politely declined and continued hiking. Halfway through, the guide told them that they could go as far as the first half. Being experienced hikers, they paid the guide and continued until they came to a fork in the road. As they were debating which road to take, a couple stumbled upon them and told them to take the left side. They continued following the couple even as it got dark and it started to rain. Suddenly their flashlights turned off simultaneously, but they still tried to follow the couple. When the rain stopped and their flashlights came back on, the couple were gone, and one of the group members slipped and almost fell to their death from a ravine. My maternal grandmother and great aunt lived in this area called Soso, Mississippi, near Rose Hill. One day they had forgotten to get water for the house, and her grandmother made them go all the way to the creek, along with my great aunt, and fill up buckets for water the next day. Now there was this lady who was born mentally challenged, and during a time where people in the area didn't have adequate medical care and weren't knowledgeable with how to deal with people like that, they kept things to themselves and tried to handle it as best they could. There was no social support system. The social support system was the family. This woman was born to a couple in the area, and as they grew, she noticed that she wasn't right, so they pretty much left her to fend for herself. She would go in the woods and literally became an animal with long fingernails and long hair and bloodshot eyes, but she could imitate a panther perfectly. Food was something she could get, which pretty much amounted to children, so she developed a hankering for human flesh. People in the community told their children after a few were lost to not take too long at the creek. So my maternal grandmother and great aunt went to the creek one night, and about the time they made it back, this woman, or what could loosely be described as a human being at most, stuck her head out from the tree and looked at them and made a panther call. It was the first and last time they saw her.
I was out solo hiking in Italy in 2016. It was memorable for two reasons. The first instance was a strange one. I was on a trail to Monte Forato, a natural stone arch that overlooks the coastline, giving stunning views to the sea and northern part of the Apuan Alps through it. Anyway, halfway up the trail, I met a couple descending. I presume to be husband and wife. They were in their 50s, and as we get closer to each other, I think the male of the couple is looking a bit upset or flustered. I try not to dwell too much on it, but as our paths crossed, this guy stops in front of me and puts his right hand on my shoulder. I see he was physically shaking, pale, and looked really upset. I did not take his approach to be a threat in any way, but I was just a little put off. I don't know enough Italian to communicate appropriately anything for this situation, so I just blurred out, "You okay, mate?" in Italian, and he replied to some mumbling I didn't really understand. But what it meant I do not know. His wife then put her arm around him and said in broken English something to the effect of, "It's okay, you look like someone he once knew." And with that she pulled her husband away, and they walked down the mountainside. It was like the guy had just seen a ghost. Obviously I have no idea who I reminded him of. I just hope he wasn't too upset from it. I have a second story, and I think I know how the legend of the faun, the half-man, half-goat, came to be. This time I was lost. I was no longer on a designated trail, but knew from my map that if I followed this stream downhill, I'd come across a road a few miles down and would be back on track. Well, almost. This stream turned into a steep rock ravine, which then sunk into a sinkhole, which was a bit big to get around. So I back up and went to the high ground to find a better route down. I was doing this when I came to the top of a small ridge with a derelict shepherd's hut. The roof of red tiles had long since collapsed, but the walls were still standing with a single broken window doorway. It was broken, still needing to be worked out a better route. So I threw my backpack on the ground, pulled out my map against the wall of the hut. 10 minutes must have passed when I suddenly heard something walking over the broken tiles inside the hut. Startled, I jumped up and stood away from the building. I heard the breaking of tiles underfoot again, but there was a lightness to the sound that told me it possibly was not human feet making the sound. With this thought, I gingerly approached the broken window to peer through. To my surprise, it was a mountain goat. I let out a laugh, and with that the goat scarpered away out the back of the hut. Intrigued, I went back to see where it headed. This goat was super fast. When I got round the back, there was this super steep V-shaped valley. It was gone, or so I thought. That is when I thought I saw a very muscular man with horns sprinting up the side of the valley. It took my brain more than a moment to work out that the steep incline gave the perspective of the goat running up right in bipedal fashion. If I hadn't have had the privilege of seeing this mountain goat moments before in the hut, I would have been convinced I'd have just seen a goat man from ancient mythology running up the incline.
I've been doing my 1 hour of outdoor exercise at night because I find it most relaxing. My neighborhood is very quiet, and I'm lucky to live in a nice area which I've always considered super safe. I used to walk at night before lockdown because I live right next to a canal, so there's lots of nice paths that are super pretty at night, when everything is lit up by the moon. I was walking last night and decided to go to the shop first because I was hungry, and then detour back to my usual route along the canal. When I was walking, I heard two guys speaking super loudly in German. I live in the UK, so it was a bit unusual, but not anything I thought about twice. They looked around 30, pretty tall, and had caps on, which I remember because they had matching designs, which I thought was funny. They started getting really close, and when I glanced back to look at them, they started jeering, so I knew they were looking at me, which kind of freaked me out. So I sped walked towards the shop. I had to stop at the road, as I wasn't planning on getting hit by a car. They caught up with me, but didn't stop for the lights to change, and just walked across and went to the store I was heading for. So I shrugged it off and walked towards the canal for my walk. I stopped thinking about the men soon after, chalking it up to me being a generally anxious person. I don't like walking past strangers at night, and I'm self-conscious enough as it is without them walking or talking to me. Anyway, I complete my walk and am heading home. For the story makes sense, I need to describe where I stood. On the right there was the water itself. I'm stood in the middle of the path, and to my left there's a big drop that goes straight to the main road. Next to the road there's a row of houses and a railway bridge in front of me. I have my earphones in and my music is pretty loud, but I think I hear someone shouting, so I take out an earphone and listen. But it's pretty silent apart from the passing cars on the road below. That's when I see the two men heading towards the bridge, and I immediately recognize them as the two guys who had jeered at me before their caps. I stopped walking as my anxiety flooded back, and considered calling someone because I irrationally thought that if I'm on the phone as I walk past, they wouldn't annoy me. But despite the fact I've been standing for ages frozen, and no one comes out from under the bridge. I wait, staring at the bridge for a while in complete confusion, because there's no way they could have just vanished. I can see through the other side of the bridge, so I know they didn't just turn around or walk away or anything, but they certainly hadn't walked through because no one passed me. After a few moments, I start to think I might have hallucinated them, despite the fact I have no history of this, and I started slowly walking towards the mouth of the bridge, and just as I'm about to step in I see it. The shadow of one of the men cast across the wall. My blood literally ran cold as I realized what was going on. They were waiting for me at the other side, but they must have hidden so that I wouldn't see them. My mind went to a million different places, panicking about what they would do if I walked under the bridge. I was convinced they'd just follow me. If I stayed where I was and phoned for help, I was certain they'd come out to see what was going on and I'd be trapped. I did the only thing I could think of. I quietly ran to the fence that separated the canal path from the drop to the main road and climbed it. It was only about thigh height, and on the other side there was a small space before the wall and drop itself. I waited for a few moments as the cars passed, but thankfully I live in a quiet area that was relatively rural, and so the road was soon empty. And I managed to navigate myself so I could lower myself off the drop without A, making too much noise, or B, hurting myself. I hit the road and raced to the other side where the houses were and sped walked down that path as fast as I could without making noise, only glancing back when I was nearing the end of the road. The men were still there next to the bridge, and I could see that they were looking through the bridge to see where I had gone. I felt sick and terrified, but I made it home. I don't know what they wanted. I don't know who they were, or if they'll be there again tonight. But I do know I'm not going to be walking for a long time after that. So strange bridge men, let's not meet.
About 100 meters elevated up the cliff. It's the middle of the day in summer. There's plenty of light and warmth. And after working my way ahead alone through some thicker forest that my wife didn't want to pass through, I came to a clearing covered in a thick layer of bleached shells, literally thousands of large shells 100 meters off a cliffside in the scrub. I started to look through the shells and filmed some of the videos to see if anyone on Instagram knew what would cause this phenomenon. I had picked out a nice shell that was still fully intact, and upon placing it in my pocket, I kid you not, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and it suddenly felt like midwinter. Paired with a sudden coldness, I have not felt something like that ever. I felt like I was surrounded by a multitude of spirits, and I got the feeling that I wasn't welcome there. The closest thing I could compare it to is what I imagine prey feels like before a hidden predator is about to come and pounce on it. I was suddenly and inexplicably in full fight or flight mode. I placed the shell back and hightailed it out of there, backed out the clearing, and I was instantly feeling fine. After some research and confirmation, the site would have been undiscovered Aboriginal middens, which is the word used for a collection of items, often the remains of leftover meals, from when Aboriginal communities lived in places a few hundred years ago, and in peace. I shared this story with my wife, but the site is so hard to access that I didn't bother telling many people. I have explored many creepy abandoned buildings in my time. Old abandoned buildings, derelict drive-in movie theaters, mental hospitals in the middle of the forest, but this one takes the cake for the sensation of me needing to get out there now.
I am a 72-year-old man. This happened a long time ago, but I remember it very well. The background was a series of events that placed me in a mountain cabin outside of Frederick, Maryland, circa 1970. Just say my life at the time was disarray. I had dropped out of college, my father had died very badly, and I was alienated and needed to get my mind right. The opportunity to move to an isolated cabin to live in contemplation and solitude was welcome. I had some inheritance money to pay for it. To the best of my memory, I was there 8 to 9 months. No TV, but books and radio. I had a library card, and can't remember if I had a phone. The story begins when a month into my stay, a female beagle showed up at my door. She was a lost dog. I took her in. Never could train her to do anything, but I fed her and she was sweet, if not the brightest dog. A few months in, I began to feel a presence around the isolated cabin. Hard to describe, but I felt like someone was watching. On many occasions, I thought someone might even be looking in my cabin window, watching us. The next phase was the shadowing, or following. I knew the folks a half-mile down from the lane, woods all around, and would sometimes visit them at night. Someone, or something, was waiting for me, and followed closely in the woods beside me in the darkness. You could hear it easily, footsteps in the woods, and it picked up its pace as I did. This not only happened to me, but my younger brother who visited, and to friends, and it spooked them big time. At night, it was out there, around the cabin. But here's the funny thing. I was never afraid and never felt threatened, not at all, at least not early on. There was no feeling of malevolence. I spent a good bit of time wandering the vast area of woodlands around me. There was a state park just up the hill, and the Frederick Municipal Forest went on for mile after mile. The whole of western Maryland was much more countryside than it is now. None of the development had started yet. In our hikes, the dog and I came across evidence of campsites, recent ones in the woods, traces of fire, old abandoned buildings that had corners and gave shelter and looked slept in, garbage, food and drink, paper, what have you, perhaps hunters, but much of it did not have the organized feel you get from experienced hunters. The last month of my stay there was when things intensified. Maybe he sensed I was preparing to leave. In the morning I would find small dead animals at the bottom of the front steps. The cabin had a small front porch, screened with a light door, and 4 wooden steps to the ground. A spotlight would illuminate the long front yard, with woods close by on either side. Dead animals began to appear at the steps many mornings. I remember small birds, then a squirrel, a rabbit, and even a weasel one day, like they were offerings. I had to grab them up before the dog ate them, and this went on for almost daily for several weeks. One night very late, I was awoken by some sound. I lay in bed and heard something from the porch. I hopped up and hit the lights, and saw that hound dog, who never learned to sit or stay, standing at the front door, in a perfect point position. She was shaking in fear. She never barked, and I heard the door slam and footsteps down the steps. I hit the spotlight but saw nothing. I went out. He had been at my front porch, maybe trying to enter. After that I stayed in at night more and more. The animal offerings got bigger and bigger. Large birds, a possum, a woodchuck. It wasn't funny. The final 2 gifts were legs from either horses or cows, big and bloody. One was skinned. The second to last day, the dog left me. I could hear her in the woods, howling on the trail following a scent. I looked for her in every way I could. Came up in following weeks, but to no avail. She left as she came. I moved back to the Maryland suburbs of DC, got an apartment with a friend, got a job and moved on with my life. One day not long after, I picked up the Washington Post, and there was an article about a recent encounter with the Sykesville monster. It described a tall Yeti-like creature, fur-covered on 2 legs, that would pick out a family or person and give them attention. I wasn't the only one. The attention described in the article was exactly what happened to me. Following you at night, looking inside the house, gifts and so on. I was shocked. If I had turned on that spotlight and seen a Bigfoot or a Yeti, I might still be running. But I think I knew who it was. Sykesville, Maryland was the location of the Springfield Hospital Center, a large psychiatric hospital. It was 20 miles or so east of Frederick. Back then, many folks knew how to live in the woods. They grew up that way. Country folk. I think the monster was an escaped patient, or just a free schizophrenic who lived outside. This is like all the homeless you see in the cities now, probably off his meds, but somehow functional and lonely. He would pick people or families to adopt. The camps in the woods could have been him. Nothing to do. He would make mischief. I think he liked me, but sensed I was leaving. I can't prove any of this, just a theory. My monster was very much of the time and place, and his behavior was what I noticed in nearly every case then. I do not think he could have survived until the 80s. Deinstitutionalization of the mental hospitals threw the mentally ill out onto the streets and took away the shelter of hospitals. Unprotected, the mentally ill die. My first overnight backpacking trip with a friend. We're both female. I parked my car at a trailhead, loaded my gear into my friend's van, and we headed to another trailhead to sort out our stuff, sleep in the van, and get an early start for the next morning. This trailhead is very popular, just off a main highway. The plan was to then backpack through a pass and back to my car. It started to get dark, and we have everything pulled out, and the last people are coming down to their cars. It's dark now, and there were a few cars left in the lot. Then I notice 2 older men hanging around. They did not look like hikers, and were not acting like hikers. They would talk to each other, but at an oddly far distance from one another, and were facing us, not each other. Every time I looked in their direction, they were standing in a different spot watching us. I instantly felt danger, like electricity buzzing on my skin. My friend was oblivious, rationing food or something. Next thing, they started talking to her, asking her strange questions and making comments about a big party. I'm wondering if the trailhead gets chained at a certain time. I don't know why I'm even saying this. It sounds innocuous, but the dudes were creepy, and fanned out in a strange way. I felt hunted. My friend, without saying a word, started throwing our gear back in the van and we hauled ass, messing up our packing. I held my knife and tried to shine my headlamp on it in their direction, as much as possible, truly ready for fight or flight. Dude stood there and didn't back away. We drove off before I even had a chance to close my door. I've never been so angry. It sucks to live in a world in which you must fear for your own safety like that. My friends and I used to hike a lot near my place. I live in a nice, quiet, well it was quiet then, neighborhood very close to a mountain. Over time we started exploring and eventually made our own path by clearing away plants and stuff. The path was kind of hidden. You had to go out of the trail, which wasn't frequented a lot. One day we were almost at the top of the mountain, which is a 4-hour hike, fooling around, and I took out my camera and started recording a video of my friend doing a stupid dance. We hiked uphill for another hour, until we got to the end of the trail we made, and then went back down. We walked to my place and split. When I downloaded the photos and video to my computer, I noticed the unmistakable shape of a man crossing the trail about 20 meters from us. This is a hidden trail we made ourselves, and it takes 4 hours to get there. I'm pretty sure we were followed, and I still don't understand how we didn't notice. From that day on, we always took one of our friends' huge St. Bernards with us when we went hiking. Some other weird stuff happened there. We would hear strange noises, sounds like ooh, and at certain times of the day, it happened. We also found a grave. The name was Margarito Esperanza. Again, this was in the middle of nowhere. There wasn't even a trail there before we made one. We also found a creepy cave with a wooden door and iron fitting. The door looked hundreds of years old. The tiny cave was empty, but I never had the balls to go in there without a flashlight. I wish I'd have taken a picture of it. Unfortunately, that part of the mountain is now inaccessible due to urban development that happened in 2006 and 7. It was a Friday evening, maybe around 6 p.m. I was walking my dog through the woods. I was wearing headphones, and I used to walk here all the time on this route, so there's no reason to be afraid. It was very rare to see anyone else walking at this time on a Friday, which is why I had actually chosen to take this time to walk. I'm coming down through this field/valley when all of a sudden I start to feel on edge. The feeling just keeps getting worse, so I turned off my iPod and took my headphones out. I was half jogging by the time I got to the bottom of the field. My dog had taken off way ahead of me at this point. I squeezed through a hole in the fence and onto the dirt path surrounded by trees, and took the usual right and kept checking behind me. Well, here's the horrifying part. I kept turning around to check if anyone is behind me and see a someone or some shadow-like figure, which is more than what this looked like, flick from behind one tree to another. I think I audibly yelped at this point, but I kept power walking. I was still fairly close to whoever/whatever it was, and tiny teenage me knew that I was unlikely to be able to outrun it. I kept walking a few more paces before turning around again. This goddamn thing is now standing right in the center of the path further back near the trees, and it has its arms straight down, but out from its sides. Its hands were fists, and it was standing there, with wide legs. I say thing because it looked like the shadow of a man. It looked like it had a cloak and a whitish brimmed hat, but the whole figure was completely opaque. It just looked angry, and it's staring right down the path at me. Needless to say, I sprinted home from there and practically had a panic attack when I made it back. No idea what it was, but I know what I saw. This was in the UK, and the urban legend about that woods, and the crossroad in particular, is that they used to hang people back on the oak tree back when. Whatever the hell it was, it's something I'll never forget.
When I was around 14, I really liked to go for runs with my dog. It was a German Shepherd/Labrador mix. and I lived in a fairly quiet and clean suburban neighborhood that was situated beside a broad expanse of pasture used by about 10 horses, I would say roughly 40 acres. A bike path ran between the pasture and my neighborhood, and I generally ran down the path. One night I decided to go with my pup at around 10 p.m. May not seem like the smartest decision, but I had spent many nights with my group of friends biking or rollerblading around the neighborhood, so I thought nothing of the late hour. I was running down the bike path with my dog, who was a big pup yet the friendliest guy you'll meet. As we ran, I noticed a dark lump a little ways ahead, and because it was nearly pitch black I could barely see it. I dismissed it as a garbage bag, and as we drew closer my dog perked up his ears and his hackles went up as he started to growl, which he rarely does. He loves basically everything. I stopped running and stared at the garbage bag, which started to move. 14-year-old me still didn't really know what the heck I was looking at, and it wasn't until the supposed garbage bag stood up that I realized it was a man, who then began to run towards us. My dog then turned around, and I kid you not, started to run and yanked me along behind him. We reached a street. He darted down it, then pulled me into a dark alley on another street, then another alley, then another street, until we somehow lost the guy. I'm fairly certain my dog saved my life. The guy may or may not have been an axe murderer, but it turns out some creepy ex-felon was arrested in our neighborhood about 2 days later. What do you think? I'm fairly certain it was this guy. Who knows what he wanted to do with me? And all I have to say is that I love my dog. I was hiking with my boyfriend and his cousin during the day near a quad trail, fairly high up in a mountain. My boyfriend and his cousin decided to take a dip in a small body of water we found, and I decided to continue along on my own. We were camping/hiking on Crown Land, and came out the day before the weekend started, so the area was not too busy yet. We never ran into anyone on the trail, and didn't hear any OHVs. I ventured a little under a half-kilometer away from the guys by myself, and came up an incline and around a corner, and the path ahead was straight, so that I could see quite a way in front of me. I saw a dark-colored animal ahead, walking on its own towards me, and for some reason my first thought was that it was a dog. But as quickly as that thought came into my head, I realized there were no people near me by the animal. It was quite small, and I immediately thought bear cub. I didn't see any other signs of a larger animal nearby, but I also didn't take a second look. I immediately turned around and have never run so fast in my life. When I caught up with the guys, they wanted me to wait out to see if a hiker came down the mountain, but no one did. Now, I could have been completely wrong, and maybe a hiker had their small dark-colored dog off the leash on the trails, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I live out in a rural area. My bedroom has one of those sliding glass doors that's just a big sheet of glass with a frame. One night a few months back, I'm chilling in my room around midnight when I notice something outside through the corner of my eye. Now I see plenty of wildlife around the place, raccoons, foxes, squirrels, deer, skunks, and more. I'd seen a fox outside my door not long before, so figured it was a fox again. I saw the tip of a tail and started thinking of the fox. When I followed the body, it was too large to be a fox. Then I followed it to the head, and the head turned to look at me, and Christ, it was a mountain lion. I had to hold in the urge to piss myself and just turned and walked the hell off. I didn't want to deal with that. I was camping in the middle of nowhere in Washington, near Mount Rainier. Like, not an official campground, just way out in the forest, where I wouldn't have expected another human for miles. One night I wake up and hear something. Open my tent. There is a guy sitting by where my fire had been right outside it. Nothing particularly noteworthy about the guy, just a fairly regular looking dude sitting there a couple of feet from my tent.
No bag or pack or anything. Just him, just a guy. He saw me open the tent. His eyes got huge like he'd seen a ghost, and he took off. It shook me up pretty bad, but over the next day, I managed to put it out of my mind fairly well, after writing it off as just some odd occurrence, and a guy that was probably high or something, and had somehow managed to set up a camp coincidentally not too far from mine. Then after that, 15 miles away in a totally random direction that no one could take the same path as by accident, I was sitting by the fire that night and started hearing noises, and I got more and more convinced it was a person. I called out to them, and out of the darkness someone was like, "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" "No," I say. I didn't even think it was a real place. They kept talking from just out my line of vision. I tried to see them with my flashlight, but they yelled, "Aim that away," and kind of spooked, and I didn't want to piss off a potentially crazy person. After 15 minutes of being very freaked out, and them talking and asking completely random questions from the darkness, it sounded like the voice had gotten closer, so I shined my light that way again, and it was the same dude who'd have been outside my tent 2 nights before. He had to have been following me for at least 15 miles over 2 days, because there's no way he could have just accidentally woken up in the same spot, as vast as that wilderness is. No way. As soon as my light hit him, he took off again. I started to chase him but didn't want to get lost in the wilderness, so I quickly stopped after 100 to 200 feet. This one couldn't have been written off, because the only way he could have been in both places is if he were following me. I decided the trip was over first thing in the morning, and hiked back over 3 days, consistently doubling back, trying to see if I could throw anyone off my trail, and occasionally hiding and waiting to see if he would come by. I really can't describe how terrifying it was to feel like I was being hunted through the woods, and to actually have to brainstorm on things I could do to potentially avoid being murdered. On the first night of the hike out, twice I heard what sounded like a person walking circles outside my tent, but by the time I mustered the courage to look, no one was there. On the second night I heard what I thought was an animal making noises at first, but then I slowly decided it sounded more human, and that it was trying to imitate animal calls. It could have actually been an animal, but I didn't really see the guy again. But it really sounded like a person making the howling. I literally almost cried when I finally got back to my car. The relief was so strong. To this day, probably the most terrifying experience I've ever had. I have no idea who the guy was or what his intentions were, and no way of getting an explanation, but I really can't articulate just how terrifying those few days were.
When I was 18, I dated a girl my parents did not approve of, and because of this I ended up moving out of my house and living in my car. Her house was in a very rural area, and so I would park my car at the entrance to an old field, walk across it, and through some woods to her house and hang out with her, then go back to sleeping in my car at night. This went on for several weeks. I never felt scared traversing the woods or the fields at night, at first, as my girlfriend's dog would follow me the whole way and then return home. But then came the night I reached my car, and the dogs had not followed me. I could faintly make out, in the distance to the north, the sound of drums. They were like tribal drums, the kind you hear in films during a ceremony or ritual, with a slow and steady beat. As I stood by my car listening, trying to identify what was happening, the realization hit me. About a mile or so to the north was located a cult on a dead-end road, and that's what I'd heard when I was a young teen. I didn't know what they were into exactly, but talk in my small childhood school had been of animal sacrifices and your typical creepy goings-on. My mind immediately seized upon that, and the obvious answer. They were doing some kind of ritual, and the sound was carrying through the thick woods that separated them from me. I got into my car and tried to get some sleep. A few hours later I awoke to the sound of growling and something hitting my car from underneath. Dog, coyote, whatever. But after that happened, I was much more on edge crossing the woods and field at night. I heard the drums almost every night after that. Then one night, while climbing into my car, I looked out the windshield and saw a human shadow figure standing in the field I had just crossed, the form silhouetted against the lighter night sky. I was startled, but assumed it was my girlfriend's stepfather, who otherwise didn't know I was camping out there. Thinking he followed me and that my gig was up, I turned on my headlights to light up the field and face him. But when I did, the field was empty. I was so shaken by it that I drove away and slept in the parking lot of a country church. It wasn't long before I came to my senses and got away from that girl. That ended my experiences for a while. However, about a year later, I began attending a church about 30 miles away. I found out that the youth pastor actually lived about a mile north of where I had those experiences. In fact, the youth pastor lived on the dead-end road where the cult was located. When I found out, I asked her if she had ever experienced anything paranormal from the cult. She told me the cult had actually been gone for about a decade, and she had moved onto the street a few years after they left. However, she began to tell me about her experiences when she first moved there, of hearing drums outside, and her young daughters talking about seeing the shadow people who ran around in the trees that encircled their property. I could not believe what I was hearing, for it clarified and verified what I had experienced. She then told me she had done some research on the history of the area and learned it had been frequented by Native American tribes due to a fresh spring nearby. So what I had assumed to be a cult, I now assumed to be some kind of paranormal event connected to them. Sometime later, I dated a girl who lived about 2 miles south of where I had had my experience. When I brought up what happened to me there, and the youth pastor's explanation of her experiences at her home, my girlfriend freaked out, telling me her mother would sometimes take a bottle of alcohol out into the woods, only to come back hours later drunk and insisting that she had been, in her own words, dancing with the Indians. We broke up not long after, but one night she called me terrified, asking me to come over because she was being attacked by an unseen entity that was shoving her around in her room. I drove over and gave her some inspirational music to put on. She asked me to stay until she fell asleep, and I sat there as she laid in bed. A shadow form appeared in her room, floating up near the ceiling in a corner, and emanating darkness, like it was glowing black. Somehow I boldly faced up to it, and prayed silently for it to go away, and in moments it just vanished. Then she spoke up, which was weird because I thought she was asleep, and asked if I had been praying. I told her I had, and she just confirmed that she knew something was there. We left it at that. I went home. It's been over 20 years since, and I've never experienced anything like that again. I lived in the middle of nowhere in my youth. When I was old enough to start hunting, on my first time out, I was wandering and tracking deer, and was not paying attention to where I was going. After it was getting towards noon and my sealed food supply was running out, I decided to go back. As I looked around, I noticed I had no idea where I was. Being young and lost and very scared, where I lived there were black bears, moose, elk and coyotes, so it was possibly deadly out here. Luckily, it was too cold that time of year for rattlesnakes, and this was before cell phones, though they don't work well in my area anyway. I kept my panic as best I could, and just walked backwards. I came home, near nighttime, like 10 hours on this hike. I had all sorts of fear on the way back, of being lost forever to the forest. Back in 2008, I was a student planning to go to university and needed some extracurricular stuff I could put on my entry applications. As most UK students know, one of the best to have on there is the Duke of Edinburgh Award. As part of this award, you have to embark on an orienteering expedition,
Basically a long trek throughout woodlands and rural villages following nothing but a map and compass. No GPS allowed. It's a teamwork experience, and you camp and overcome hurdles together, etc. I was out of shape at the time, so my uncle volunteered to take me out to the middle of nowhere to get some idea of what orienteering was like. We didn't stay out overnight, which is what I would need to do during the real thing, but we hiked 10 miles through woods in a small village in pretty abysmal weather. By the end of the journey, we were soaked to the bone and pretty miserable, looking forward to getting back in the car and heading home. For the last part of the journey, we were on a dirt trail heading uphill with bushes and trees on either side. We were marching onwards in silence at this point, until all of a sudden there was a rustling in the foliage to our left. From behind a large bush stepped an old man in a black suit with a red bow tie and dress shoes. He looked to be in his late 70s or perhaps early 80s. Very pale, with liver spots dotting his face and a grey and white comb over to match. I was instantly weirded out. Who dresses like that to go into the woods? The instant thought is that seeing some guy at this age out in the woods in these clothes and in these weather conditions is that this guy has certainly lost his marbles. There was something else that took me an extra moment to notice though that puzzled me. He was bone dry, didn't even have mud on his shoes. We stopped in our tracks and just stared at the man for a moment, who appeared to be as frozen and shocked as seeing us. My uncle made the first move, taking a step towards him, asking if he was all right. The old man continued to stare for a moment, not moving even a twitch, then became suddenly very animated. It was like he suddenly snapped out of a trance. He began flailing his arms wildly, saying something awful had happened, and that a good friend of his needed help. He began walking backwards into the woods, motioning for us to follow him, which we did. We started off at a brisk walk, then escalated to running as we struggled to keep up with the old man. After a minute, he disappeared ahead of us. We could hear him and continued following the noise until we reached a huge slope. We stopped at the edge and looked down to see the old man standing at the bottom, motioning us, pleading with us to follow him. I remember looking down at the slope. It was probably a 40-degree angle and spanned for at least 50 feet or more and slick with mud. It looked like an accident waiting to happen, especially given there were no shrubs or roots to hold onto or anything. I remember looking down at the old man on the other side of the slope and wondering how the heck did he cross it so quickly and cleanly. I mean, at that distance it's hard to see any fine detail clearly at all, but I swear he didn't appear wet or muddy at all. Me and my uncle looked at each other, and I saw that he was getting as weirded out as I was. Despite my feelings, I made a step towards the edge, and was going to try and make my way down, when my uncle grabbed me firmly by the arm and pulled me back. "Something's wrong here," he said under his breath. We took a few steps back from the edge, and at this point the old man at the bottom started to get irate. He began pleading with us to come down the slope, telling us he needed our help. His friend was in trouble. My uncle shouted down at the old man that we would head back to our car and call emergency services. That professional help would be on its way soon, and they would have all the tools that they needed to help. The old man then got furious and began jumping up and down, demanding that we come down the slope right away, or there would be hell to pay. His voice changed drastically at this point. He was now practically growling his words, his hands bunched up into fists, pounding his knees like an angry toddler throwing a tantrum. I've never seen a grown adult fly into such a rage in my life. His eyes looked like they were on the verge of bursting out their sockets, his skin gone pale to red in almost an instant. We began to hurriedly make our way back the way we came in, his demands and threats getting less audible as we got closer to the trail. Once on the trail, we practically power marched the remaining quarter-mile or so to the car. All the while, my uncle was on the phone to the emergency services, explaining to them that there was a possibly mentally ill man wandering the trail. We were ordered to get into our car and await the police so that we could show them where we had encountered him. About an hour later, we met 4 officers, 2 of whom had dogs with them, and a pack of supplies like first aid and emergency blankets. We led them to the exact spot and then pointed the 2 officers with dogs in the direction he led us through the bushes, and the search lasted a weekend, but there was never any trace of the old man. Officers said the only trail they could pick up had been mine and my uncle's. They didn't find any footprints or anything belonging to the old man we encountered. This has been one of my weirdest experiences to date. I have to preface this story by saying that yes, I was young and dumb, and made some major mistakes here. I don't need any judgments, trust me, I know how stupid I was. But on to the story. I was 18 years old and had just joined the army. I was doing my basic training in Georgia in the middle of summer. I was struggling with some mental issues at the time, and to make a long story short, I was in the process of getting chaptered out of the army, aka quitting. My squad mates and even drill instructors had all told me it was going to take months for me to get out, and I'd still be stuck there past Christmas. Mind you, this was June. I was very distraught about the thought of being stuck there, forced to do meaningless chores till January, while my mental state deteriorated. But then a drill sergeant decided it would be fun to deceive me, and convinced me that if I went AWOL, ran away, and made it home, they would simply send me my discharge papers and I would be free. Looking back now, that was clearly a trick, but at the time I was desperate and bought into what he said. I hatched a plan to sneak out at night with a buddy from another unit. We were going to walk on the train tracks in the nearest town and catch a bus home. Easy enough, right? The night finally came for our escape. I snuck out of my barracks and headed to the meeting point. Upon arrival, I noticed my buddy wasn't there, and after waiting 30 minutes I realized he wasn't coming. It was too late for me to try and sneak back in, so I was on my own. I headed to the tracks, made it right onto them, and headed into what I thought was the direction of town. Boy, was I wrong. Walking on the tracks in the middle of the night, surrounded by woods, was a bit creepy, but I figured it wouldn't be long, and that I'd get to where I needed to be. After walking for over an hour, it hit me. Maybe these tracks weren't going to take me where I needed to go. And when I found a dirt path, I made the stupid decision to leave the tracks and follow that instead. The path led me past some fake houses set up for training and continued into the woods. This whole time, mind you, it's dark, and I have nothing but the moonlight to see with. I kept hearing noises in the woods and seeing shapes in the trees and bushes lining my path. Eventually on this path, I spotted some kind of wild dog wolf sitting just off the left side. By the time I had noticed it, it was too late to go back. My only option was forward. I faced the animal and backed up against the right side of the path as much as possible, and slowly kept moving down it, never taking my eyes off the canine. Oddly, he never moved or showed aggression, just watched me as I inched by him, possibly because he was full, or maybe he just wasn't interested in me. I honestly have no idea. After passing him, I continued until my path died and ended in a 50-foot drop. At this point, it had been hours. It was hot. I was alone, scared and thirsty. I had no idea where I was or what my next move should be. So I glanced around my surroundings, and the only thing I could see besides the wood was a radio tower off in the distance to my right. Here is where I made my big mistake. I decided the radio tower couldn't be that far away, and someone had to be there to help me, right? So I left my path, headed into the woods straight towards the radio tower. As you can imagine, it didn't take me long to realize once I headed into the woods that now not only was I lost, but I was lost in the almost pitch black woods, with no way to find my way out. I continued to march in the direction I thought the tower might be in, slowly losing hope of ever seeing anyone again. Now tired and bleeding from my legs thanks to thorn bushes and my dumb idea of wearing shorts, I was on the brink of giving up, where I came across a dry creek bed with a log in the middle, and out of frustration and hopelessness I climbed onto the log and screamed as loud as I could for someone to help me, which of course got no response. After several more screams, I heard a rustling in the bushes on the creek bank behind me, and I turned around just in time to see 3 wild dogs jump out of the bush and glare at me like I was dinner time. I absolutely lost it here. I ran in the opposite direction of them as I heard them taking off after me. I was terrified, running through the darkness with them chasing me, screaming at the top of my lungs and thinking that this was going to be how I'd die, painfully torn apart by wild dogs in the woods and then eaten. I don't know how far or for how long I ran, but eventually I came to a downed tree that was leaning on another, and I scurried up, praying they wouldn't climb it. I finally looked behind me and they were gone, nowhere to be seen. I wasn't sure if they had stopped chasing me, but I was relieved that I hadn't become their dinner. The rest of the night is mostly a blur of walking through dark woods and hearing other animals. At one point I couldn't do it anymore and was just gonna lay down and give up. As I sat down facing my own mortality, the thought hit me that they probably wouldn't even think to search the woods for me, and that my family, friends and girlfriend would never have any idea of what truly became of me. That thought is what kept me going, and made me continue to try and find my way out. Eventually the sun came up, and I had survived the night. The lights brought with it some comfort, since I could now see everything. After a few more hours, I stumbled upon a ribbon tied to a tree, which out here could only mean one thing: a land navigation marker for training. I knew that if I kept following the ribbons, they would eventually lead me out. And eventually, they did. I made it back to the path and ran into a sergeant who was heading out in his truck to go fishing. He returned me to my unit, and I paid for my actions and was eventually discharged. I learned a lot from this experience and have a wonderful life now, and I'm thankful for every day that I'm alive, and will never go into the woods again without a flashlight. While this experience was terrifying and life-changing, I am glad I went the wrong way on that track and didn't make it AWOL, or I would have gone to jail and not been where I am today. My dad grew up on a forestry in Queensland, Australia, as the son of a forest ranger. My whole life we've spent a lot of time out in that forest, camping and driving through parts of the forestry that only rangers would travel on occasionally. One place that my dad loved to take us was a little farm in the middle of the forest that was impossible to find unless you knew where it was. Locals knew the place as Spike's Hut. Spike was a local farmer who had lived there for decades until the 90s, and had a reputation for being abrasive, violent, bigoted, and not concerned with the laws of men. He had a habit of approaching guys in the bar who were wearing earrings and tearing them straight out, and there were a few stories about people who displeased him disappearing. Basically, Spike was not a nice guy, and his farm hut reflected that pretty well. Dad would take us out there every time we visited the forest, and the hut would be more and more dilapidated, but the vibe was always the same. That straight-up feeling of being watched, even though Spike was long gone. As I got older, I became more aware of the signs of life in the place when we went to visit. There would be 44-gallon drums full of smashed beer bottles, fire pits with reasonably fresh coals. Someone was definitely out there. God knows why, since the place was literally a snake pit at that point. But Dad didn't seem too concerned. One trip when I was a teenager, things got strange real quick. My friends and I were piled into my dad's 4x4 and were driving through the bushes to Spike's, so Dad could tell his scary Spike stories and freak us out. We drove onto the property and something immediately caught my eye. Up on the hill opposite Spike's hut, there were what appeared to be a cowboy slumped against a log, hat over his face, taking a nap. Something about his body position looked unnatural and uncomfortable. It wasn't the way you'd sit if you were taking a casual nap in the middle of work, and even if it was, there was no reason for anyone to be out there. The farm was long defunct, and there was no forest business to be taken care of by the property. I pointed it out to my dad, and instead of letting us get out the car at Spike's, as he usually did, he said he wanted to keep driving through the farm to show us something. He maintained that it was nothing, but that if the figure was still there when we came back, he'd stop and check it out. Of course, whatever he wanted to show us seemed totally made up as he drove us through the forest a bit. And when we came back, I spotted the slumped over cowboy again, not having moved an inch, still in the same unnatural position. I yelled out to Dad to stop, reminding him of the promise, but instead he acted like he couldn't hear me, locked the truck doors and drove off the farm faster than he'd ever driven on those dirt tracks before. My friends and I all looked at each other in confusion, but we all knew that when it came to this area, questioning my dad was futile and at best dangerous. My dad denied any of the events that day ever happening after that, but my friends and I were still curious about what was going on out there. So a few months later, we went camping on our own to see if we could find Spike's hut. It took hours of driving through the forest to find the gate to Spike's property, but eventually we found it without Dad's help. Something was just off once we got there, more so than usual for that day. My mates jumped out the car, but were suddenly frozen, not wanting to walk any closer to the hut for no visible reason. The vibe was just wrong that day, and it felt like we had walked into something that didn't belong to us. The tug in my gut to get out was strong, but I'd spent 2 hours finding the place and I was gonna explore it. One of my friends acted brave and walked from the car to the hut with me, quietly acknowledging more and more signs of inhabitants, with nods between us. We said nothing to the others, but were on high alert. It felt like someone could be back any minute, or that they'd never left and were watching us as we poked around the debris. We walked up to the side of the hut to find a kind of small shed with 3 walls, and I heard my friend's voice go squeaky as he called me over to look inside. On the ground was a huge pile of ash from what looked like a cooking fire, and confirming this was the presence of a giant makeshift grill made from cross-hatched wire sitting over the fire, hinged on the shed wall. As I'm looking at this setup, I fear that whoever has been here has been hunting and cooking large chunks of their kill over the fire. Pretty clever, actually. But then my stomach dropped. As my eyes traveled down from the grill to the ground, I saw a baby sock. Tiny, pink, and terribly out of place. Then another. Then a shirt, a ribbon from a child's hair, all sitting right beside the ashes on the ground, next to a woman's weekly Christmas cookbook. That's when the alarm bells in my head went off, and I rounded up my mates to get out. Some ranger or crazy old bushy hanging out at that trashed hut was one thing, but there was absolutely no reason for a baby to be out there. There's no way anything good could have come from having a child's clothes right under a huge fire and grill. When we got back to the campground, we couldn't shake the rotten feeling of being watched, and all of us were so unsettled that we packed up our stuff and decided not to stay the night. When I got home, I told my dad about it, and he just shook it off, saying weird stuff happens out there. Being young and dumb, I never thought to look up missing persons in the area in an attempt to explain either the cowboy or the kid's clothes. But I can tell you, I will never make the mistake of going out to Spikes without my father again. I was backpacking through Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina with my dog. Just the two of us, and we were exploring the woods around Little Lost Cove, open orienteering style, so we were not on an established trail. We'd been hiking through the day following a creek, and towards the evening I noticed my dog was acting abnormally. She was very much caught in the scent of something and wouldn't ease up. This continued for about 2 hours before we made camp. That night in camp she remained on edge and stared off into the woodline. I went about camp business as usual. Then at around midnight I got this prick like I was being watched intently. I let the feeling ride for a bit and kept tinkering with the fire. Then I heard the brush rustle. I got up from the fire and shone my flashlight in the hillside. A figure on all fours just managed to escape the beam, all but the tail. It was a tail I knew that was not supposed to still exist in the southern Appalachians. I cast my light across the hillside and this time caught its eyes. 2 glowing yellow orbs just watching and waiting. At that point I went into a fury, grabbed my tomahawk and charged up the hill after the beast, screaming curses all the while. The watcher ran off, but neither I or the dog slept that night. The following morning we left camp at first light and began hiking up the mountain to the ridgeline which would lead us out. Atop the ridgeline in the fresh mud were a series of tracks left by an animal that officially no longer exists in the eastern US. They were catamount tracks. They commonly go by cougars in the east, but we'd been stalked by mountain lions just the same. Those tracks ran across the ridge, revealing it had been watching us and stalking us throughout the previous day as we hiked through the creek bed below. They weren't bobcat trails, I know that. They were way too big, as were those eyes I saw. I truly believe that if my dog hadn't been there to give me red flags, I would have been mauled that night, and it remains one of my personal scariest experiences ever. The details I have on this story are very vague, but someone told me about a teenager who went into the Ocala National Forest to hike and then was reported missing several days later when he didn't return home. A couple of months later he was found in the woods, and he was like a different person. He appeared to be either drunk or under the influence, but when he was tested, everything came back negative. Mentally, he wasn't all there, but physically wasn't showing any signs of being exposed to anything which would cause this. He kept telling people that he encountered something very strange. It was several months before he was himself again, and he had very little memory of what had happened all those days. I've asked people that I know who live in Ocala, or have camped and hiked in the Ocala National Forest, and they'd never heard of this story. I really didn't know if this person who told me this story knew if it was true or not. Sounds like it might be true and strange, and weird things have happened in state and national parks. But I do know that over the years people have gone into the Ocala National Forest and never come out. Some of them were harmed or killed by animals. Others had their lives ended abruptly by other humans. And some just vanished without a trace. I've driven through the forest on State Highway 40, and at night, it's creepy, even in the day at times.